Rain finds the air into threads, each droplet separating from its neighbours with surgical precision, transforming the evening into something that exists between mist and downpour. The street below your apartment window has become a canvas of puddles, their surfaces turning mirror-smooth in those brief seconds between drops, holding the amber glow of street lamps like cupped hands holding light. You stand at the window with a cup of tea gone cold, watching the way water collects in the worn depression where the sidewalk has settled over decades, and you think about how many small compromises it takes to create such a hollow. Inside, the radiator hisses its evening complaint, and you turn from the window to find them. Wet footprints leading from the bathroom to the kitchen, each one a clear, shallow puddle that holds your silhouette perfectly. Not the blurred impression of a wet sole, but a precise outline, as if someone had traced your foot in water and left it there for you to discover. You haven't walked that path in hours, haven't been to the bathroom since before the rain started. Yet there they are, a trail of your own shape crossing the hardwood in a route you didn't take. You follow them backward, your dry feet making no sound, and notice how they grow fresher as you approach the bathroom. The water still trembling slightly, as if the foot had only just lifted. When you move, standing perfectly still and then shifting your weight from one leg to the other, the reflections in the footprints hesitate, holding their position for a heartbeat before adjusting to match your new stance. They're listening. You realise with a chill that has nothing to do with the autumn cold seeping through the old window frames. The water is listening for your next step. From the bathroom, you hear it. A low humming rising from the sink drain, threading through the pipes like sound through water, which is to say strangely, with a quality that seems to move in multiple directions at once. It's not quite a melody, not quite language, but something caught between the two. A drowned singer practicing scales in a flooded auditorium, learning the acoustics of a space that was never meant to hold water. The humming shapes itself around syllables that sound uncomfortably like your name, though distorted by distance and medium, as if someone far below were calling up through fathoms of dark water, hoping you might hear. You turn on the faucet, some primitive instinct suggesting that running water might drown out the sound, might wash away whatever impossible thing is happening in your apartment. But the humming only grows clearer, riding the current, emerging with the water as if it had been waiting for an invitation. You shut off the tap quickly, and in the sudden silence you hear your neighbour's television through the wall, the ordinary sound of a Thursday evening game show, and you wonder if you're simply exhausted, if the mind can manufacture hauntings from nothing more than stress and bad sleep and the particular loneliness of autumn rain. But the footprints remain, and they are not the product of exhaustion. You know about the Rusalka, of course. Everyone who grew up near water knows the stories, though the details shift depending on who's telling and how much they've had to drink, and whether they're trying to frighten children or explain something that happened to them when they were young and foolish near a river at night. Your grandmother told you the version she learned from her grandmother, who came from a village where the river ran swift and cold, and claimed at least one person every spring when the ice broke up and the water rose hungry. The old ferry hands, your grandmother said, knew better than to speak carelessly near water. They understood that a Rusalka doesn't chase bodies the way the stories in books suggest, all seduction and drowning and tragic beauty. No, the river spirits are more patient than that, more particular in their hunting. They chase untrue steps. Each small lie you tell, your grandmother explained while braiding your hair with fingers that never fumbled, leaves a pocket of water the world keeps as a memory. Not the big lies, the ones you tell with full knowledge of their falseness, but the small ones, the social lubricants and convenient omissions, the promises you make knowing you'll break them, the appointments you claim to keep when you are never planning to show. These lies settle into the spaces between things like water, finding the low places in a landscape. They pool in corners, gather in the hollows your daily passage creates, wait with the patience that only water possesses. When enough of them gather, when you've created a sufficient map of untruths that outline your life like a negative space photograph, the Rusalka learns your gait. She studies the rhythm of your steps, the weight of your passing, the particular way you move through the world while speaking words that don't match your intentions. And then she echoes you home. She doesn't arrive with drama or announcement. She simply begins to follow, asking softly, in that voice that sounds like water moving over stones, for a truth to weigh her down. The Rusalka, your grandmother said, pulling the braid tight enough to make your eyes water is not evil. She is lost. She drowned in a moment of untruth, her own or someone else's, and now she cannot rest because water remembers everything and forgives nothing. She walks behind the dishonest, learning their patterns, waiting for them to offer her something real, something with enough weight to anchor her to the bottom of the river where she belongs. She rests only when you anchor a true word with river stones in the place that word belongs. You had asked your grandmother what that meant, how you could anchor words with stones, and she had smiled her particular smile that suggested she knew more than she would tell you while you were still young enough to make careless promises. "You'll understand if you need to," she'd said, "and if you live honestly, you'll never need to." But you haven't lived honestly. Not completely. No one does, you tell yourself, as you stand in your bathroom watching water bead on the porcelain, listening to the humming that has now resolved into something almost musical. You've told the small lies that everyone tells, the ones that smooth social interactions and prevent awkward conversations. You've claimed to be busy when you simply didn't want to go, said you'd call back when you never intended to, promised to think about things you'd already decided against. These are normal, you insist to yourself. These are how people navigate the world without constant conflict and hurt feelings. But the water doesn't care about your rationalizations. The water keeps its own accounting. Your phone vibrates on the bathroom counter, the sound startlingly loud in the small tiled space. You pick it up, see a text from Sarah. "Still on for tomorrow?" The coffee date you agreed to 3 days ago, the one you've been dreading because Sarah wants to talk about her mother's illness, and you don't know how to sit with that kind of sorrow, how to hold space for pain you can't fix. Your fingers hover over the keyboard, forming the lie you've already composed. "So sorry, something came up at work. Rain check." You pause before sending, and in that moment of hesitation, you notice the water. A wet ring has appeared on the bathroom counter, perfectly circular, exactly where no water should be. As you watch, another forms beside it, then another, as if invisible glasses are being set down one after another. Your phone's typing clicks seem to ripple through the air, and each keystroke leaves behind a small puddle of condensation on the screen that shouldn't exist. The texts you don't send still leave wet rings on the table, you think, your grandmother's voice echoing in your memory with a warning you'd thought was metaphor. You delete the unsent message and type instead, "Yes, looking forward to it." The words feel heavy, committed, true. The wet rings fade instantly, evaporating as if they had never been, and the humming from the drain pauses listening. That night, you dream of drowning, but not the violent choking horror of it. Instead, you dream of sinking slowly through clear water, watching the light fragment and refract above you, feeling the pressure equalize in your ears and the cold seep into your bones with an almost gentle insistence. In the dream, you're not afraid. You're simply descending, following footprints that glow phosphorescent in the deep water, each one a perfect outline of your own foot, leading you down to where the river bottom waits with its accumulation of lost things. You wake to rain still falling, though lighter now, and find that your apartment has acquired new habits overnight. The hardwood floor gleams with a moisture it shouldn't hold, and when you walk to the kitchen, your footsteps leave no prints behind them, but the floor ahead of you shows impressions appearing before you arrive, as if something is walking your path a few seconds in advance, marking where you will step before you step there. The street lamps outside smear in puddles that have arranged themselves with unusual precision along the curb. You watch from your window as a man walks past with his dog, and the puddles remain still, reflecting only what they should. But when you look down at the sidewalk directly below your building, you see them move. Not dramatically, not with any splash or disturbance, but they slide slowly along the curb, maintaining their position relative to your window, as if they are not puddles at all but eyes, watching, waiting, learning the territory you occupy. You call in sick to work, which is itself a small untruth because you're not sick in any conventional sense, and immediately you feel the air grow heavier with moisture. Feel your clothes begin to cling slightly to your skin as if the humidity in the apartment has suddenly spiked. The bathroom mirror fogs over despite the radiator's dry heat, and when you wipe it clear, you see that your breath has traced a path across the glass that curves downward, as if water preferred another route than the one breath naturally takes. The condensation runs in rivulets that defy gravity's simple pull, moving in spirals and loops that spell nothing you can read but everything you understand. I am here. I am learning you. I am coming closer. Your mail arrives, pushed through the slot in your front door with the usual thump and scatter. Among the bills and advertisements, you find receipts you don't remember keeping, printouts from purchases and promises made weeks or months ago. As you watch, they begin to curl at the edges, the paper darkening with moisture that seeps from nowhere. The ink feathers, bleeding into soft clouds of blue and black that obscure the details, but somehow make the essential truth of each transaction more visible. Here is where you promised to donate. Here is where you said you'd volunteer. Here is where you claimed you'd follow up and never did. The humming has found a key now, and it matches your stride. You pace your small apartment, trying to outthink the impossible thing that is happening, and the sound from the drains. They're all humming now, kitchen and bathroom and the small sink in the corner you use for plants. Rises and falls with your movement. 3 notes per step, a minor melody that sounds like lamentation and anticipation braided together, like a lullaby sung by someone who's forgotten most of the words but remembers the feeling they were meant to invoke. You need to go out. The walls are pressing in, the moisture in the air making it hard to breathe, and you need to move, to be among people and normal things and the ordinary cruelties and kindnesses that have nothing to do with water spirits and accumulated untruth. You grab your jacket, check your phone, see 17 unread messages that you've been avoiding, and step into the hallway. The carpeting is soaked. Not just damp, but saturated, water squelching up around your shoes with each step, though your neighbours' doors remain dry, their welcome mats undisturbed by any moisture. You descend the stairs quickly, hearing the wet slap of footsteps behind you that match your rhythm exactly but are not your own, and emerge onto the street where the rain has paused, leaving everything slick and reflective. You walk without destination, letting your feet choose the path while your mind races through memories of small dishonesties, trying to catalogue them, trying to understand the weight of accumulation. The corner store where you shortchanged the elderly owner and never corrected the error. The friend whose birthday you missed and claimed to have marked on the wrong date. The volunteer shift you signed up for and simply didn't show, offering no explanation, letting them manage without you while you stayed home and felt only mild guilt that faded within hours. At the footbridge that spans the narrow canal running through your neighbourhood, you stop. Fog is rising from the water, though the evening is not particularly cold, and it braids itself with the willow branches that hang over the stream in a way that seems too purposeful, too designed. You lean on the railing and look down at the water, which is higher than you've ever seen it, risen almost to the banks in defiance of the light rain that fell. And as you watch, the water rises further, not flooding, not spilling over the concrete edges of the canal, but standing up. The surface tension breaks in a specific place, and a shape emerges. First a suggestion, then a definition, then something that cannot be explained away as fog or shadow, or the tricks tired eyes play in dim light. A girl shape, water holding form through will or magic, or the weight of accumulated sorrow. Her hair moves like eelgrass in a current, long strands that float and drift though there is no wind. Her dress appears to be made of current itself, the fabric flowing in patterns that suggest rapids and eddies, moving in ways that cloth cannot move but water does constantly. And her eyes, you cannot look directly at them, cannot hold their gaze, because they are 2 pale stones under glass, smooth river rocks wrapped in the clear lens of water, looking at you with an expression that might be pleading, or might be accusation, or might be simple recognition. You never see all of her. When you focus on her face, the rest of her form becomes suggestion and possibility. When you look at her hands where they rest on the bridge railing, wet knuckles leaving puddles on the metal that glow faintly in the streetlight, her face becomes peripheral, a pale oval that might be a trick of the fog. She exists in pieces, assembled by your attention, held together by something other than physics. You step back from the railing, and your foot lands in a puddle you don't remember seeing. The water is deeper than it should be, cold soaking through your shoe instantly, and when you lift your foot you see your footprint remain behind, perfectly defined in the water's surface. You watch as the footprint fills, water rippling inward to complete the shape, and then, impossibly, horribly, it walks. The waterprint lifts from the pavement with a soft slap and continues forward, past where you stand frozen, following the path you were taking before you stopped. More footprints appear now, a trail of them forming in the moisture on the bridge, each one your size and shape, each one walking independently, surrounding you in a slow processional. They make no sound except that wet slap of water meeting stone, and they smell of river bottom and old metal and the particular cold that lives in deep places where light does not reach. The Rusalka, because that is what she is, what she must be, despite every rational protest your mind offers, begins to sing. The humming that has haunted your drains and followed your footsteps resolves into words, or what passes for words in the throat of something made of water. She repeats your lies in a lullaby cadence, each one truer for being spoken aloud, reflected back at you in a voice that is your own voice, drowned and distorted and made strange. Something came up at work, she sings, and you remember every time you use that phrase to avoid commitment, every cancelled plan and broken promise hidden behind professional obligation that was more excuse than truth. I'll call you back, she continues, and you see the faces of people who waited for calls that never came, whose messages you read and dismissed and forgot, whose reaching out you treated as burden rather than gift. I'm fine, really, she sings, and this one cuts deeper because you hear the hollow performance in it. All the times you smiled and insisted you were managing when you were drowning, all the help you refused to accept out of pride or fear, or some broken idea of strength that left you alone with struggles that could have been shared. The water girl moves closer, or perhaps the bridge grows smaller, or perhaps distance has become negotiable in this moment between rain and clearing. You can smell her now, not decay or death, but the mineral richness of river water, the green scent of algae and growing things, the copper tang of old springs running through limestone. She's not grotesque, she's simply other, wrong in the way that living things become wrong when they have stayed too long in a place they were never meant to inhabit. Help me, she says, and her voice is your voice, and also the voice of everyone you have disappointed or dismissed or deceived with your small, self-serving untruths. I cannot rest while you keep walking these crooked paths. I cannot sink while your lies keep me buoyant, holding me in the shallow places where the living and dead blur together. Your legs tremble, not from fear but from the sheer weight of recognition. You understand now what your grandmother was teaching you, what the old ferry hands knew, what every culture that lived close to water learned and passed down through stories that were never meant to be metaphorical. Truth has weight, lies create buoyancy, and the dead who cannot rest are those caught between, held at the surface by the accumulated dishonesty of the living, unable to sink into the peace of deep water, unable to rise into whatever comes after. What do you need, you ask, and your voice sounds small and very young, the voice of a child asking how to make amends for a broken thing. The Rusalka gestures, and you notice she's holding something, a length of cord, thin and dark and woven from what might be hair or river grass, or the twisted fibres of water weeds. In her other hand, visible for just a moment before your attention makes it peripheral again, she holds a river stone, smooth and grey and heavy with the patience of water, wearing away resistance. You understand before she explains. The knowledge comes not from thought, but from something older, something that lives in the part of your mind that still remembers when rivers were gods and truth was not philosophical but essential to survival. You kneel on the bridge lip, the stone cold and unforgiving against your knees, and reach out your hand. She places the cord in your palm, and it is real, solid, though wet in a way that seems permanent, as if it can never truly dry. The stone she sets beside your knee, and when you touch it, you feel the weight of all the water that has passed over it, all the years it has spent being shaped by current and time. For every lie you told, the Rusalka says, and her voice has lost its singing quality, become simply sad, simply tired. You must choose one truth small enough to keep, one truth you can speak without destroying what remains of your life, one truth that can serve as anchor. You think of all the lies, the catalogue of small dishonesties that brought you here, and you begin to sort through them, looking for truths that can be spoken without ruining relationships or career, or the careful structure of normalcy you have built. Not the deepest truths. Those remain too large, too sharp, too capable of cutting through the foundations of everything, but smaller ones, honest admissions that carry weight without being weapons. You speak the first truth. I was late to my mother's birthday dinner because I didn't want to go. I wasn't stuck in traffic. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, making myself later, because I didn't want to face her disappointment that I hadn't found what she considers a real career. As you speak, you tie a knot in the cord, pulling it tight around the stone, feeling how the simple act of knotting binds the truth to something solid, gives it form and consequence. You lower the stone into the water, letting it sink, and feel something shift in your chest, a lightness that might be relief or might be loss. The second truth. I took credit for Sarah's idea in the meeting. I let everyone believe it was mine because I needed to look competent after the previous project failed. She never said anything, but I saw how she looked at me afterward, and I never acknowledged it, never apologized. Another knot, another stone. You have taken more from the bridge railing, finding them placed there as if the Rusalka has been collecting them. Another weight sinking into current. The third truth. I told James I loved him when I wasn't sure I did. I said it because he said it first, because it seemed expected, because I was afraid of being alone. I lived in that lie for 8 months before I finally ended it, and I never told him the real reason why. This knot is harder to tie, your fingers clumsy with the shame of it, but you manage, and the stone drops, and you feel something in your throat loosen, some held thing releasing. You continue, speaking truths like prayers, like confessions, like the accounting the water has been waiting for you to complete. Who you were late for, what you took, where you left calls unanswered. You give each truth its place, its weather, its hour, making them specific enough to matter, detailed enough to have weight. The cord grows longer as you work, the Rusalka providing more length as needed, and the pile of stones beside you seems inexhaustible. 1 truth, 2, 3, anchor points the river can hold, places where your dishonesty has been replaced with admission, where the buoyant lies have been weighted down with the gravity of acknowledgement. Your knees are numb from kneeling, your voice hoarse from speaking, and still you continue, because you understand now that this is not punishment, but exchange, not penance but trade. You are giving the Rusalka what she needs, and in return she's releasing you from the haunting you created through your own careful dishonesty. Finally, when you have spoken and bound and lowered more truths than you thought you possessed, you hesitate. 1 stone remains, smooth and pale, different from the others. The Rusalka has moved closer, close enough that you can see the details your attention usually denies. The way her form ripples slightly as if struggling to maintain cohesion, the exhaustion in those stone and glass eyes, the weight of water holding a shape it was never meant to hold. Last, she says, you offer a stone with my truth if you know it. You don't know her truth. You don't know her name, her story, the specific dishonesty that brought her to drowning and trapped her in this liminal state between death and rest. But you know water, and you know this river, and you remember your grandmother telling you about the bend where the current runs fastest, where the ice breaks early each spring, where people have been pulled under for as long as anyone can remember. The bend, you say slowly, piecing together story and geography and the particular way she looks at the water as if it is both home and prison, where the river narrows and the current runs swift. In spring, when the ice breaks, you slipped, or were pushed, or chose to step into water that was colder than anyone could survive. And no one spoke your name after. No one kept saying it, so the water couldn't learn how to let you go. The Rusalka's form shivers, water droplets falling from her like tears, and you know you have touched on some partial truth, some fragment of her drowning that matters. If I don't know your name, you say, and your voice is gentle now, recognizing the shared haunting, the way you're both trapped by silences and omissions, then I offer keeping instead. I will speak the missing names aloud when it rains, all the forgotten ones, all the people who slipped into water or silence and were not marked, not mourned, not kept in the speaking of living mouths. I will give you that weight, that remembrance, that anchor. You tie the final knot around the pale stone, and as you do, you speak a name, not hers because you don't know it, but one you do know, a girl from your middle school who drowned during summer camp, whose death was spoken about in hushed tones for a week and then forgotten by everyone except her parents and the particular stretch of lake where it happened. You speak her name and the date and the details you remember, and you lower the stone into the water. The singing that has followed you for days, that has hummed through your drains and matched your footsteps and repeated your lies in lullaby cadence, changes. The Rusalka's voice lifts and blends with your own, creating harmony instead of echo, the two tones twining around each other like the cord around the stones. She's not singing your lies anymore. She's singing gratitude, or farewell, or the complicated emotion that comes when a long burden is finally permitted to drop. The water footprints that have been walking independent circles on the bridge pause, their movement slowing, becoming uncertain. You watch as they begin to settle back into simple puddles, losing the definition of your shape, becoming again just water resting in the low places of the stone. The Rusalka herself grows less solid, her form beginning to dissolve at the edges, water returning to water, shape releasing back into flow. Sleep, she says, and the word carries the full weight of exhaustion that comes with finally being allowed to rest after long wakefulness. The river will keep your weight now, she sinks. Not dramatically, not with any struggle or final gesture, but simply, naturally the way stones sink when you release them into current. She becomes water, and the water accepts her, pulling her down into depths where the current runs cold and steady, and light is a memory from the surface. You watch until there is nothing to watch, until the canal is simply a canal again, slightly risen from rain but otherwise ordinary, and the fog disperses into normal evening mist and the bridge is only a bridge. By morning the rain has stopped entirely, and the lane outside your apartment dries in honest patches. The wetness that remains is distributed naturally, pooled where the ground dips, evaporating in the sun where stone has absorbed warmth. New puddles form only where the sky decides, not where your words failed. You watch from your window and feel the difference, the way the water has resumed its proper relationship with the world, reflecting what is rather than what you've avoided. Your shoes, when you put them on, leave normal footprints, wet from the morning dew but nothing more, no mirrors, no doubled shapes, no delayed following. The drains in your apartment have returned to ordinary pipe song, gurgles and rushing that speak only of plumbing and pressure, not of anything listening or learning or waiting in the deep places beneath the city. You meet Sarah for coffee, and when she talks about her mother's illness, you sit with it. You don't try to fix or minimize or redirect. You simply witness, and that turns out to be enough. And she tells you afterward that she's grateful, that she needed someone who could just listen, and you realize that this present, honest attention, is truth without stones, truth that walks in daylight without requiring binding or burial. On wet nights, you carry 3 stones and a bit of cord in your pocket. Old habit, new ritual, the weight of them comforting against your thigh. When a lie tempts your mouth, the convenient excuse, the social smoothing, the small dishonesty that would make the moment easier, you walk to the bridge and tie the truth down instead. Not always the whole truth, not always immediately, but truth enough to anchor, honest enough to keep. The river keeps your weight now. You understand what that means, that you have traded the buoyant safety of convenient lies for the heavier, more stable truth that can be examined from all sides, that you have chosen to sink into honesty, rather than float on the surface of careful performance. It is not always comfortable, this new way of moving through the world, but it is solid, and it is yours, and when you sleep your dreams are your own, undisturbed by drowned singers or water steps or the accumulating memory of small untruths. Your sleep keeps its own. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The storm fog arrives at dusk, low and dense, pressing itself against the cottage windows with the slow insistence of something alive. You watch it thicken over the dunes, erasing the horizon line between sand and sky, until there is only grey, layered and breathing. The light dies early. By the time you draw the curtains, the world beyond the glass has become a wall of vapour that seems to lean against the house, testing the frames, seeking the gaps around the sills. The wind carries the smell of exposed seabed, that mineral tang of kelp and stone, the faint rot of things left too long in open air, and it seeps through the old cottage like a draught, settling in the corners, pooling in the low places. You light the lamps, but their glow barely touches the walls. The shadows feel heavier tonight, as though the tide has left something behind in its retreat. Outside, the shore has pulled back farther than usual, exposing the bones of the coastline. Weed-slick stones jut from the sand like knuckles. Fragments of old rope, grey and fraying, lie coiled in the depressions where the water used to sit. Pale shells gleam in the dimness, scattered across the flats in patterns that look almost deliberate, like teeth arranged in a smile. The retreating tide has left shallow puddles everywhere, in the lane, along the path, gathered in the wheel ruts and hoof prints that scar the soft ground. They lie still and black, reflecting nothing but the low sky, their surfaces smooth as poured glass. When the wind pauses, you hear them. A faint ripple, a soft drumming, as though something is moving across their faces. Hoofbeats, light and quick, crossing water that holds no animal. You stand at the window and watch the puddles shiver in sequence, one after another, the rhythm deliberate and unhurried. The sound does not come from the lane. It comes from the reflections themselves. Inside, the house settles into its evening sounds. The floorboards creak, the pipes tick as the heat rises, but underneath those familiar noises there is something else. A faint vibration, a low hum that seems to come from the walls, from the glass, from the very air. The barometer on the mantel, old brass with a yellowed face, hangs crooked. Its needle twitches, jerking left and right in tiny spasms, as though something is tapping at it from the inside. You cross the room to straighten it, but the needle continues its erratic dance, unable to settle on a reading. The pressure is falling, but not in any way the instrument can measure. The air tastes wrong, salt and silt, yes, but also something sour, something that catches in the back of the throat and lingers. You pour yourself water from the tap, but when you raise the glass to your lips, the smell hits you first. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Kelp. The water tastes of the sea. The islanders have always told stories about what comes with the ebb tide. You heard them as a child, sitting in the pub while the old fishermen spoke in low voices, their faces serious, their hands wrapped around pint glasses that they barely touched. They spoke of the Nukalavy, a name that felt wrong in the mouth, hard and foreign, like a word dragged up from the seabed. It is not a ghost, they said, not a spirit. It is something older, something that belongs to the boundary between land and water, a creature that rises when the tide falls too far, when the shore is stripped bare and the mirrors of the world, the puddles, the wet stones, the rain-slicked roads, are laid open. It is skinless, they said, a horse fused with the twisted shape of a man, its body a mass of exposed muscle and sinew, its breath a poison that spoils crops and lungs, that curdles milk and blackens grain. It does not hunt by scent or sound, it hunts by reflection. Wherever water catches your image, wherever the surface shows what you are, the Nukalavy can follow. It gallops through puddles and rain barrels, through the wet glass of windows, through the sheen of sweat on your own skin. You cannot hide from what you see of yourself, but there is a way to stop it, the old men said, a way to hold it at the threshold. You take reeds from the ditches, the tough, fibrous stalks that grow in the brackish water where the land and sea argue over territory. You cut them at the right time, dawn or dusk, never noon, and you knot them into a net. But the knots must be true. Each one must represent a tide you have lived through, a specific moment when the water rose or fell and you were there to witness it. The hour, the height, the place. You tie the memory into the reed, and if the knot holds, if the memory is honest, the net becomes a gate that the creature cannot pass. But if you lie, if you guess the hour, if you round the number, if you tie in a tide you only heard about, one you did not feel in your bones, the sea knows, the net unravels, the gate opens, and the Nukalavy comes through. You have never believed in such things. You are a practical person, someone who trusts in weather reports and tide tables, who keeps a calendar and a clock and expects the world to follow them. But tonight, as the fog presses against the windows and the puddles in the lane begin their slow, rhythmic pacing, you feel the old stories creeping back into your mind. You tell yourself it is only the storm, only the low pressure and the isolation of the cottage, the long stretch of empty coast, and the hours of darkness still ahead. But when you glance at the mirror above the mantel, you see that it has fogged over. Not from the inside, where your breath might have touched it, but from the outside, as though something cold and damp has pressed itself against the glass. You cross the room and wipe it with your sleeve, but the condensation returns almost immediately, a thin film that clouds your reflection, until you are only a shape, a shadow, something barely there. The clock on the wall begins to drift. You notice it first when you check your watch, a 10-minute difference that was not there an hour ago. The clock runs fast, then slow, its hands moving in jerks and pauses that have nothing to do with the mechanism inside. It is matching something else now, something outside the house, something that does not care about the town's time or the numbers on your wrist. You turn to the tide chart pinned beside the door, the one you printed last week, the the one that should tell you when the water will rise again. But the numbers are wrong, not by much. A finger's width, maybe less. But enough. Enough that the air smells sourer. Enough that the light from the lamp seems to pull back into itself, leaving the edges of the room in deeper shadow. You reach for the chart, thinking to correct it, but your hand stops. What would you correct it to? What is the true tide tonight? You do not know. You have not been watching. The realization settles over you like cold water. For months now, maybe longer, you have been living by approximation. The tide tables have become background noise, something you glance at without really seeing, numbers that blur together until they mean nothing. You move to the cottage to be close to the water, to understand its rhythms, to let the rise and fall of the sea organize your days. But somewhere along the way you stopped paying attention. You stopped going down to the shore at dawn to see how high the water had climbed in the night. You stopped marking the spring tides in your journal, stopped noting when the neaps came and how long they lasted. The sea became scenery, something pretty to look at through the window, something to listen to as you fell asleep. You forgot that the water keeps its own time, that it does not care if you are watching or not, that it will pull back and expose what has always been there, waiting beneath the surface. Outside, the puddles begin to move, not rippling, not stirred by wind, but pacing, circling the cottage in a slow, deliberate loop. You stand at the window and watch as the nearest puddle, the one beneath the eaves, shivers and reforms, its surface shifting as though something is walking through it. Hoof-shaped ripples spread across the water, one after another, a steady 4-beat gait that has no source. You step back from the glass and your reflection steps back with you, but then it keeps moving. It turns toward the door, toward the lane, and walks out of the frame. You're still standing in the room, but your reflection is gone, walking away through the puddles, following the hoofbeats that drum across the water. You press your hand to the glass, but the cold that meets your palm is not the cold of night air. It is the cold of deep water, of something pulled from the bottom of the sea. The fog thickens. Through the window you see it move, not drifting but heaving, rolling forward in great slow waves that break against the cottage like surf. And then, at the edge of vision, where the lane meets the shore, something rises. It comes from the water, from the ebb itself, pulling itself up out of the exposed seabed with the slow, terrible patience of something that has been waiting. It is tall, too tall. The shape is wrong, jointed in places that should not bend. A horse's bulk fused with the narrow torso of a man, the join obscured by spray and shadow. You cannot see details, no skin, no gore, only the suggestion of sinew, the corded silhouette of muscle stretched over bone. The head is long, too long, a skull shape crowned with weed and barnacles, and when it turns toward the cottage, toward the lane, toward you, you see the hollow gleam of eyes that hold no light. It breathes. The sound is low and wet, a rattle of lungs that have never known air, and the breath slides across the ground like fog, pouring into every puddle, every wet surface, every mirror. Your damp footprints on the floor begin to fill with water, and then they move. They walk back toward you, heel-toe, the rhythm of hoofbeats, the rhythm of something galloping. The window glass hums, a low vibrating note that you feel in your chest, in your teeth. The reflections in the puddles gather, pooling together, forming shapes that are almost horses, almost riders, almost you. They circle the cottage, a herd made of water and light, their faces indistinct but moving, watching, waiting for the gate to open. You back away from the window, away from the door, but there is nowhere to go. The mirrors are fogging over. The puddles are inside now, seeping under the door, pooling in the cracks between the floorboards. The breath of the knuckleheavy fills the room, sour and cold, and when you exhale you see your own breath hang in the air, thick and visible, as though the house has become part of the sea. You think of running. The car is parked at the end of the lane, keys on the hook by the door. You could grab them, could make it to the vehicle before the fog closes in completely. But even as the thought forms, you know it is useless. The lane is full of puddles. Every rut, every depression, every place where the ground dips holds water now, and in each one your reflection waits. If you run, you will be running toward yourself, toward the images that have already broken free, that are already walking the paths you might take. The knuckleheavy does not need to chase you. It only needs to be wherever you are reflected, and on a night like this, with the rain starting to fall and the fog dripping from the eaves, there is no path that does not hold a mirror. The rain begins as a whisper, soft taps against the roof that grow steadily louder. Within minutes, it is drumming, a constant percussion that drowns out the subtler sounds of the house. But it does not drown out the hoofbeats. If anything, the rain amplifies them, each drop hitting the puddles in the lane, creating tiny ripples that merge and multiply, forming patterns that move with intention. You watch through the window as the rain gathers in the wheel ruts, filling them until they become shallow streams that run toward the cottage, toward the door, bringing the hoofbeats with them. The water climbs the steps, it pools against the threshold, and in its surface you see movement. Not your reflection now, but something else. Something that moves on four legs, something that drags behind it the broken shadow of a rider who has fused with his mount. You remember the reeds, the ditches along the lane where the water sits brackish and still, where the tough stalks grow in clumps, their roots tangled in the mud. You have walked past them 100 times, have pulled your boots from the sucking ground, have cursed the wet that seeps through leather and wool, but you have never cut them, you have never needed to, until now. You pull on your coat, wrap a scarf over your mouth and nose, and step outside. The cold is immediate and absolute. The fog wraps around you like cloth, muffling sound, muffling sight. You can barely see the lane, barely see the puddles that pace and shiver at your feet. But you can hear them. The hoofbeats are louder now, closer, drumming across the water in patterns that echo your own heartbeat. You walk toward the ditch, your boots sinking into the soft ground, the wet soaking through to your skin. The reeds stand tall and dark, their edges sharp, their stalks thick as your thumb. You pull the knife from your pocket and begin to cut. Dawn is coming, you tell yourself. Dawn is hours away. This is dusk, the right time, the only time. The reeds resist. The knife is sharp, but the stalks are tough, fibrous, full of water. Each cut requires force, requires commitment. Your hands grow cold, then numb. The rain soaks through your coat, through your shirt, until you are as wet as the ground beneath your feet. But you keep cutting. You need enough for a net, enough to stretch across the threshold, enough to hold. The old men in the pub never said how many reeds, never said how large the net had to be, only that it had to be true, only that every knot had to hold a real tide, a moment you had lived through, a memory that belonged to you and the water. You cut until your arms ache, until you have an armful of reeds, their cut ends weeping clear fluid, their lengths heavy and cold. Then you turn back toward the cottage, and you see it. The Nukkalavi stands in the lane, not moving, not approaching, just standing, waiting. The fog parts around it, and for the first time, you see it clearly. The horse body is larger than any horse you have known, its legs too long, its joints bending at angles that seem wrong, that make your eyes hurt to follow. The man's torso rises from where the neck should be, thin and elongated, the arms hanging too low, the fingers too long. There is no blood, no exposed organs, but you can see the structure beneath, the cords of muscle, the lattice of sinew, the smooth curve of bone. The head is worst of all. It is a skull, but not quite, something that suggests a face without fully forming one. The eyes hollow sockets that nonetheless see, the mouth a dark opening that breathes the fog. Weed clings to its crown, barnacles cluster at the joints, and from its body water runs in constant streams as though it is made of the sea itself, as though the ebb is pouring through its form and cannot be contained. It watches you with those hollow eyes, and you understand that it has always been watching, that every time you looked at your reflection in a puddle, every time you saw yourself in the wet glass of a window, it was there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the tide to fall far enough that it could rise. You clutch the reeds and walk back toward the cottage, forcing yourself to move slowly, to breathe. The creature does not follow. It does not need to. It is already inside, already in the puddles that pool against your door, already in the mirrors that fog and clear in rhythm with your breath. You climb the steps, push through the door and drop the reeds on the floor. Your hands are shaking. You peel off your coat, but it makes no difference. The cold is inside you now, settled in your bones, in your blood. You kneel on the floor and spread the reeds out, trying to remember what the old men said, trying to recall the pattern, the method. But there is no pattern. There is only truth. You pick up the first reed and tie a simple knot near one end. Then you pause. What tide will this be? What memory will you tie into this knot? You close your eyes and think back. Last winter. The king tide. You remember waking in the dark, the alarm ringing at 4 in the morning, the cold so fierce that the windows had frosted over on the inside. You had gone down to the shore with a flashlight, stumbling over the dunes in the dark, and when you reached the water's edge, you found it higher than you had ever seen it. The waves were lapping at the base of the dunes, only meters from the cottage steps. You had spent the next 3 hours filling sandbags, stacking them against the door, praying that the water would not rise any higher. It peaked at 4:37. You remember checking your watch, seeing the numbers glow in the dark, feeling the relief wash over you as the water finally began to pull back. You speak the words aloud as you tighten the knot. 4:37, king tide, winter, the cold so fierce you could not feel your hands, the sandbags, the relief, the knot holds. You tie another, autumn neap. You remember this one differently. You had taken the boat out thinking to check the crab pots, but the water would not rise. You sat in the channel for hours, the boat grounded, the hull scraping against the stones, waiting for the tide to lift you. But it never did. The neap was too weak, the pull of the moon too distant. You had walked home in the mud, furious and humiliated, leaving the boat there until the next day when the water finally came back. You speak the details, the time, the place, the feeling of helplessness, the anger at your own impatience. You tie the knot and it holds. Another. Spring ebb. The channel dry. The stones exposed. You had walked out into the middle of the channel, places you had only ever seen underwater, and the ground was alien, covered in weed and small scuttling crabs, the air thick with the smell of rot. You had stood there for an hour just looking, trying to understand the shape of the seabed, the contours that the water usually hid. You speak it, you tie it, it holds. But then you come to a knot that does not hold. A tide you thought you remembered. A morning when the water was supposed to be high, but you had not gone down to check. You had looked at the chart, seen the number, assumed it was correct. You tie the knot and speak the memory, but even as the words leave your mouth, you know they are false. You did not witness this tide. You did not feel it. You only read about it. The knot loosens, the reed splits. You untie it and sit back, breathing hard. The sea knows. Of course it knows. You cannot lie to the water. It has no patience for approximation, for guesses, for things you think you remember but did not actually live. You think harder. You go back further. You find another tide, one you did witness, one you can speak with certainty. You tie it again. This time, it holds. Knot by knot, the net grows. Each one is a confession, a memory pulled from the deep places where you have been storing them, unexamined. Some are easy, moments of drama, of fear, of triumph. Others are harder, the quiet tides, the ones where nothing happened, where you simply stood on the shore and watched the water rise or fall, where the only thing you learned was patience. You tie those two, speaking the hour, the height, the quality of the light, the temperature of the air. You tie the tides where you were angry, where you were sad, where you were so tired you could barely stand. You tie the tides where you were happy, where the water was kind, where the world felt balanced and whole. And then you come to the tides where you lied, not to anyone else, to yourself. The mornings you did not go down to the shore because you told yourself it did not matter, that you could check the chart instead. The evenings you ignored the water's call because you were too comfortable, too warm, too unwilling to leave the house. You untie those knots and retie them with the truth. I did not go. I was afraid. I was lazy. I did not care. The knots hold. Honesty, you realize, is not about being noble. It is about being accurate. The sea does not judge. It only measures. You tie the last knot and stretch the net across the threshold, securing it to the door frame with nails, to the floor with hooks you find in the shed. The net is not beautiful. It is rough, uneven, the knots bulging in some places and tight in others. But it is true. Every knot is a tide you lived through, a moment when you and the water were in the same place. At the same time, witnesses to each other. You step back and look at it, and for the first time since the fog rolled in, you feel something other than fear. You feel ready. The breath of the Nukalavy reaches the net first, a cold draught that smells of rot and kelp that tastes of deep water. The knots tighten, the honest ones hold. The reeds creak and strain, but they do not break. The reflections in the puddles begin to tangle, to twist. caught in the pattern of the net, unable to pass. You hear the hiss of water against reed, the sharp crack of something breaking, and then the hoofbeats falter. You step forward and cast the lower edge of the net out into the lane, letting it touch the puddles, letting it kiss the surfaces. You name them, one by one: gutter, trough, step, sill. Returning each mirror to its small water, its true place. The net hums, the reflections shatter. And in the fog, at the edge of the lane, the Nuckalafy rears. Its shape is clear now, terrible and thin, all sinew and shadow, and it stumbles back toward the shore, back into the ebb. The hoofbeats fade. The breath pulls away. The puddles still. Dawn comes slowly, laying pewter light over the quiet strand. The fog lifts, thinning to mist, then to nothing. The puddles flatten to plain circles, holding only sky. You stand in the doorway, the net still in your hands, and you breathe. The air is clean now, salt and cold, but nothing more. You rinse the net in fresh water, washing away the smell of the sea, and hang it along the fence, stretching it between the posts so that every knot is visible, every memory exposed to the light. You will update it when the moon changes, when the tides shift, when new memories need tying. On storm nights, when the fog crawls back over the dunes, when the shore pulls too far and the puddles begin to pace, you will lay the net at the path and read your tides aloud, speaking the hours and heights until the fog loosens, until the gate holds. The barometer settles. Its needle stops twitching, finds its place, and stays. The sea breath stays where the shore keeps it, and when the tide turns now, it lifts only the water, not your shadow. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain came down in braids that night, silver threads weaving through the darkness with a patience that suggested intention rather than accident. Vincent had been watching from his kitchen window for nearly an hour, coffee cup forgotten in his hand when the first street lamp died. Not flickered, died, as if something had reached up and snuffed it between invisible fingers. The light at the corner of Maple and 3rd simply ceased, leaving a pocket of absolute darkness that the rain couldn't penetrate. He set down his cup. The coffee had gone cold anyway, like everything else in the apartment since Teresa left, since he'd let her leave, since he'd stood in the doorway of their bedroom and watched her pack and said nothing at all when she'd asked him one last time if he loved her enough to try. The second lamp died 30 seconds later, the one in front of the Kowalski house with its perpetually dying lawn and the tyre swing that no child had touched in years. Then the 3rd marching down Sycamore Street with the methodical progression of dominoes falling in slow motion. Vincent pressed his forehead against the cool glass and counted the lamps as they failed. 7, 8, 9. A hush rippled down the block toward his door, thick as wool, swallowing the usual night sounds, the distant traffic, the wind chimes from Mrs. Chen's porch. Even the rain itself seemed to quiet as the darkness spread. Hoofbeats didn't thud so much as arrive, like a sentence finishing itself. Vincent heard them between his own breaths, a rhythm that felt familiar in a way that made his stomach clench. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. The same pattern Teresa used to tap against the steering wheel when she was thinking too hard about something she didn't want to say. The same rhythm he'd ignored for months until it stopped entirely, and she was packing her things into cardboard boxes marked with his lies. On the step, when he finally opened the door because something in him needed to see, he smelled iron and wet leather. The rain had stopped in a perfect circle around his house, as if the weather itself had stepped back to make room for something that required space. Across the lane, fog parted around a black horse, whose breath steamed like torn cloth, grey-white plumes that hung in the air and dissolved too slowly, leaving shapes that looked almost like letters in a language Vincent had never learned but somehow recognised. Its rider sat headless, cloak bellied with wind that came from no particular direction. The coat was the colour of old blood mixed with soot, and it moved with a life independent of the body it covered. Where the neck should have begun, there was only darkness, not shadow, but an absence so complete that looking at it made Vincent's eyes water. In the rider's gloved hand he carried a pale head like a lantern, fingers wrapped gently around the hair, as if it were spun glass that might shatter with rough handling. The mouth was slightly open, as if listening, or perhaps as if it had just finished speaking and was waiting for a response that hadn't come. Vincent's hand found the doorframe, His knees had gone soft, but he couldn't look away from the head. Even from 15 feet distant, he could see the details with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible in the darkness. The face was neither young nor old, neither male nor female, but something that shifted between states like candlelight seen through water. The eyes were closed, but the eyelids trembled as if the person behind them was dreaming. The skin had a translucent quality that let him see the fine network of veins beneath, pulsing with a light that had nothing to do with blood. He knew what it was. Every child raised in Ireland knew, even the ones like him who'd left at 8 and spent 40 years trying to forget the accent and the stories his grandmother had whispered while the turf fire burned low. The Dullahan, the headless rider, the collector of endings that never came. Mrs. Chen had mentioned it once 3 months ago, when he'd helped her carry groceries up her steps. She'd seen something in his face, some hollowness that prompted her to grip his wrist with surprising strength and tell him that the old stories were true in ways that mattered more than facts. That the Dullahan hunted for broken oaths, that he didn't take life but collected endings, riding the dark to the place where a goodbye had knotted itself and never pulled tight. The head he carried heard promises, she'd said. The lie about coming back, the vow to call, the bedside promise stalled by fear. Vincent had smiled and nodded and thought her kind but addled with age. Now, watching the rider sit motionless astride the black horse, he understood that Mrs. Chen had been warning him, that she'd somehow known what was coming for him the same way animals know about earthquakes before the ground begins to shake. Lamps failed along the path of his unkept words. He could trace them now, a dark line stretching back through the neighbourhood, marking every place he'd said tomorrow and meant never, every spot where he'd promised I'll call and then deleted the number, every doorstep where he'd said I love you with his mouth, but not his actions. The darkness formed a map of his failures, and it led directly to where he stood. If your door stands shut when he arrives, Mrs. Chen had said, your name enters his lantern and grows too heavy to answer in daylight. Vincent didn't understand what that meant then. He was beginning to now. The head in the rider's hand was opening its eyes, and they were full of names that glowed like embers. He could almost read them, letters forming and reforming in the amber light behind the irises. Some were fading, growing dim as their owners learned to speak the endings they'd left unfinished. Others burned bright and constant, trapped there by stubbornness or fear, or the simple human inability to admit when something was over. He stepped back into his apartment and closed the door. The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. For a moment, relief flooded through him. He was inside, safe, the door between him and that impossible thing in the street. Then he noticed that the labels on his kitchen cabinets had faded to smudges, the words he'd written in Teresa's neat handwriting when they'd first moved in together, now reduced to grey shadows that told him nothing about whether he was reaching for coffee or flour or something else entirely. The mailbox outside coughed out blank envelopes, white rectangles sliding through the slot to scatter across his floor like shed skin. Vincent picked one up and turned it over in his hands. It should have had an address, a return label, something to indicate where it came from or where it was meant to go. Instead, there was only emptiness, the paper smooth and featureless as a closed eye. The clock on the wall ran but lost the chime at the hour. He watched the minute hand sweep past 12 and heard nothing, just the mechanical tick-tick-tick of gears turning without purpose or punctuation. Time was passing but not marking itself, flowing forward but leaving no trace of its movement. Vincent checked his phone and found the date displayed as a string of question marks. The weather app showed only a blank grey screen. His contacts list had reduced itself to initials that he couldn't match to faces or voices. A damp handprint bloomed on the inside of his window, fingertips spaced too far apart to be human. The print was cold to the touch, beaded with condensation that ran down the glass in rivulets that split and merged like the branches of a bare tree. Vincent traced the outline with his own hand and found that his fingers didn't match up. The prints on the window were larger, longer, the spaces between them wrong in a way that made his teeth ache. Something had pressed its palm against the glass from the inside, as if trying to push through from wherever his unfinished endings had pooled and congealed. The horse's tack clicked with a rhythm he'd once used to calm Teresa during thunderstorms. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. He'd invented it their first year together, when she'd woken gasping from nightmares about her father's death, and he'd held her and tapped that pattern against her shoulder blade until her breathing steadied. Later, after they'd grown apart in inches and miles that never required them to physically separate, she'd asked him to do it one last time. He'd been watching television and had told her to take a sleeping pill instead. She'd stood in the doorway for 5 minutes. He'd counted them later, guilt-measuring time in retrospect, and then gone to bed alone. Muffled echoes crowded the hallway outside his bedroom, his own voice saying tomorrow in different rooms, different tones. Tomorrow we'll talk about it. Tomorrow I'll try harder. Tomorrow I'll show you I meant what I said. The words had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of postponed intention, until the hallway was thick with them. Vincent tried to walk to the bathroom and found the air resistant, as if he were wading through water. Each step required effort, and the voices grew louder as he moved, a chorus of his own broken promises playing back in surround sound. The lamps outside died in a clean line to his doorknob, the final bulb, the one mounted directly above his front step, guttering and fading until only the faintest orange glow remained, like the last coal in a dying fire. Vincent watched through the peephole as the light dimmed and finally went dark, leaving his door the terminus of the blackness that had swallowed the street. When he touched the brass knob, it was cold as a coin on the tongue, that specific chill of metal that has been sitting in ice water or pressed against dead flesh. He looked through the curtain because he couldn't help himself, because human nature demands that we witness the things that terrify us most. Through the fabric he could see the cloak, the saddle, rain beads stuttering along a spine with no head above it. The rider had dismounted and stood now on his walkway, boots leaving no prints in the wet concrete. The horse waited behind him, patient as stone, its eyes reflecting nothing but darkness. The carried head tilted, ear aimed at Vincent's door as if waiting for a particular syllable. The angle was precise, calculated, the kind of listening that doesn't just hear sound but measures silence, weighs the space between words. Vincent realized with a jolt of recognition that the head was listening for his voice, for the specific frequency and timbre that would match the promises he'd left unfinished. It was tuning itself to him the way a radio dial searches for a signal through static. Its blank gaze glowed faint amber from within, pulsing to the rhythm of Vincent's breath. He tried to slow his breathing and watched the glow dim slightly. When panic made him gasp, the light brightened, synchronizing itself to his body's involuntary rhythms. They were connected now, he and the head, linked by the invisible thread of broken oaths. Every breath he took fed the lantern, made his name burn brighter among all the others trapped in those terrible eyes. The horse turned its skull toward the mailbox, and Vincent saw that it too was eyeless, its sockets filled with the same amber glow that emanated from the severed head. The rider's free hand lifted and a nail clicked against the door, 3 times, like a heartbeat forgetting. The sound was gentler than Vincent expected, almost polite. The knock of someone who knows they'll be admitted eventually and sees no need for urgency. Tap, tap, tap. Each impact resonated through the wood and into Vincent's chest, settling somewhere behind his sternum where regret had been accumulating for years. His name unthreaded inside him, syllables falling apart. He tried to say it, aloud, Vincent Michael Carrera, and found that the sounds wouldn't connect. Vin, Cent, Mi, Chael, Se, Re, Ra. Each piece existed independently, refusing to form the whole that would identify him as a single person with a single history. He was fragmenting, becoming a collection of unfinished business rather than a man, and he understood with perfect clarity that this was the Dullahan's gift. Not death, but dissolution. Not ending, but the eternal state of almost ended, perpetually on the verge of closure but never quite arriving. He realized the line of dead lamps stopped exactly where he'd failed to finish the goodbye he still owed. Not to Teresa. That wasn't the one that had called the rider. No, this was older, deeper, the wound that had infected everything that came after. He hadn't thought about it in years, had trained himself not to think about it, but the Dullahan's presence stripped away the scar tissue and left the original injury exposed and weeping. Michael, his brother, his twin. They'd shared a womb and a bedroom and every secret until the night Michael had told him about the pills he'd been taking, the thoughts he'd been having, the bridge he sometimes drove to and parked beside just to see if he had the courage. Vincent had been 23 and stupid with his own invincibility, and he'd said all the wrong things, told Michael to stop being dramatic, told him everyone felt sad sometimes, told him they'd talk about it tomorrow, he had a date he couldn't miss. Michael had nodded and smiled and said, "Okay, tomorrow then," and Vincent had grabbed his coat and walked out into the night, feeling relieved to escape the heaviness of his brother's desperation. Tomorrow never came. There was only the phone call at 3 a.m, his mother's voice broken into pieces smaller than words, and the drive to the bridge where Michael's car sat empty with the keys still in the ignition, and a note on the dashboard that said only, "You promised we'd talk." Vincent had spent 20 years building walls around that night, convincing himself it wasn't his fault, that Michael had been sick, that no single conversation could have changed the trajectory of depression. He dated and married and divorced, and never once admitted that he was running from that moment in the doorway when his brother had reached for him and he'd stepped back. Every relationship since had been a rehearsal for that goodbye he never spoke. Every tomorrow, another brick in the wall that kept him safe from his own culpability. The Dullahan knew, the head in his hand knew, the horse knew, the entire street knew now, the darkness a public announcement of Vincent's central failure, the sin that had spawned all the others. He remembered the old rule then, the words floating up from his grandmother's stories like bodies rising from deep water. Endings must be spoken whole, place, weather, time, and the last true words. The Dullahan couldn't take what was freely given, couldn't harvest, endings that had been properly articulated and released. He collected only the unfinished, the half-said, the promises that died in the throat before they could be born into the air. Vincent moved to his bedroom and opened the box he kept on the highest shelf of his closet, the one he never looked at but couldn't throw away. Inside was everything of Michael's he'd kept, a watch that had stopped at $2.47, a wallet with $7 and a gym membership card, a set of keys that didn't open anything anymore, and beneath it all the letter Vincent had written 3 days after the funeral and never sent, 20 pages of apology and explanation and grief that he'd sealed in an envelope and addressed to nowhere. He lit a stub of candle he found in a drawer, something left over from a power outage years ago, and set a metal cup on the windowsill to catch the rain that had begun falling again in his small sphere of darkness. The water filled the cup slowly, drop by drop, each one a word he should have said. He opened the door only as wide as the candle's heat would reach, a crack of light that spilled onto his doorstep and caught the edge of the rider's cloak. With eyes fixed on the horse's chest, never the lantern face, never directly at the head, Vincent began to speak. His voice cracked on the first words, throat constricted by decades of silence, but he pushed through. At the apartment on 7th Street, September 23rd, 2003, when the air smelled like diesel and coming rain, I should have said. He paused, gathering the words that had calcified in his chest. I should have said I was scared too, that I didn't know how to help you, but I wanted to learn, that you weren't being dramatic, that I heard you, that tomorrow wasn't good enough when you needed me that night. He returned what he'd borrowed, Michael's watch, the wallet, the keys, laying each into the cup of rainwater. The objects sank slowly, displacing water that ran down the outside of the cup in paths that looked like tears. For every finished goodbye, Vincent rang a small bell that had belonged to his grandmother, the one she'd used to call them in for dinner when they were boys playing in the yard. Once for, "I'm sorry," once for, "I should have stayed," once for, "You deserved better than my tomorrow." The head tilted, listening, and the amber glow began to dim. Vincent could see his name burning there in the lantern of those eyes, letters bright and sharp among the others. As he spoke, the letters began to fade, the light leaching out of them like ink dissolving in water. He kept talking, kept ringing the bell, kept laying pieces of Michael into the cup until his hands were empty and his voice was raw. "I loved you," he said finally. "I love you still. I don't know if that matters now, but it's true, and I should have said it when you could hear it. I should have said it every day. I'm saying it now and I'll keep saying it, and if that's not enough, then I'll learn to live with not being enough. But I won't leave it unsaid anymore. This is me finishing what I should have finished that night. This is me closing the door properly instead of walking away and leaving it ajar." The head slowly turned away, the profile sharp against the darkness, and then the glow dimmed to coal. The The rider's hand loosened its grip on the hair, and for a moment Vincent thought the head would fall, but instead it seemed to lighten, to become less substantial, until the rider was holding only mist that dispersed into the night air. The street lamp nearest Vincent's door flared back to life, bright and sudden, and then the next lamp, and the next, the light returning in the reverse of the order it had failed. The rider mounted the horse with the same fluid grace he'd shown dismounting, and the two of them turned and rode back the way they'd come. Vincent watched until they disappeared into the fog, the hoofbeats fading not into silence but into possibility, the sound of a story that had found its ending and could finally stop repeating. Dawn rinses the block, turning the wet pavement gold. Glass shines where hours ago there was only the opacity of accumulated breath and unspoken words. Vincent's name fits his mouth again, syllables reconnecting into something whole and pronounceable. He says it aloud, Vincent Michael Carrera, and hears it land in the air the way words are supposed to land, with weight and presence and the dignity of completion. He doesn't go back to bed. Instead, he sits at his kitchen table and begins writing. First to Teresa, the letter he should have sent when she asked him one last time if he loved her enough to try. He tells her the truth, that he didn't, not then, that he was too broken to love anyone properly until he'd finished grieving his brother. He tells her he's sorry for wasting her time, for letting her believe his tomorrow meant anything when it was just another word for never. He doesn't ask for forgiveness because he knows he doesn't deserve it, but he gives her the ending she earned, complete with place and time and the last true words he should have spoken in their doorway. Then he writes to his mother, who he hasn't called in 6 years, whose messages he's deleted unopened because hearing her voice reminds him too much of the night she called to tell him Michael was gone. He tells her about the Dullahan, about the rider and the head, and the lantern full of names. He tells her that Michael's name is gone from that lantern now, that he's finished the goodbye he should have spoken, that maybe they can learn to talk to each other again now that the silence isn't quite so heavy. He writes to old friends, to ex-girlfriends, to his high school guidance counsellor who'd believed in him when no one else did and who he'd never thanked. He writes to everyone he owes an ending, giving them the closure his cowardice had denied. Some of the letters he'll mail, others he'll burn, the words released into smoke and intention. It doesn't matter which is which. What matters is the speaking, the finishing, the refusal to let another goodbye knot itself and strangle in the silence. On wet nights afterward, he keeps a vigil kit by the door, bell, twine, candle, a list of promises to close before they can call anything to his doorstep. He adds to the list when he catches himself saying tomorrow, when he feels the familiar urge to postpone and defer and push difficult truths into some mythical future where he'll be brave enough to voice them. The list keeps him honest, the bell keeps him ready, the candle keeps him in the practice of making light against darkness. Sometimes lamps die down the road, and he hears hooves pause at other doors. When that happens, Vincent lights his candle and rings his bell 3 times, not for himself, but for whoever the Dullahan has found. A small act of solidarity with all the people who've learned too late that goodbyes matter. When the wind folds his curtain inward, he speaks one goodbye early, choosing something from his list and finishing it before it can fester into the kind of wound that calls riders out of folklore and into the fluorescent-lit streets of modern suburbs. He starts calling his mother every Sunday. He sends Teresa a small cheque each month with a note that says only, "For the years I wasted." He visits Michael's grave on the 23rd of every month and tells his brother about his life, the small victories and the persistent struggles, talking the way he should have talked that night when Michael needed him to listen. He doesn't know if the dead can hear, doesn't know if it matters. But he speaks the words anyway, finishes the conversations he left hanging, closes the loops that his fear had left open. The head listens less when goodbyes are said on time. Vincent knows this now, knows it the way he knows his own heartbeat, the way he knows the weight of rain on autumn leaves. He's learned that every ending is a gift if you speak it properly, that closure is the kindest thing you can give someone, that tomorrow is a thief that steals the present if you let it. So he practices finishing, he practices goodbye, he practices the small courage of saying the last true words before the Dullahan has to come and collect them from his silence. And on nights when the rain braids itself into silver threads and the lamps flicker with possibility, Vincent opens his door and stands on his step and breathes the iron-scented air. Not because he's called the rider, but because he's ready if the rider comes. Because he's kept his house in order and his promises current and his goodbyes spoken whole. Because he's learned, finally, that the only thing more terrifying than endings is the eternal state of almost ended, and he refuses to live there anymore. The street stays lit now. The lamps burn steady through the rain, and if hoofbeats arrive in the night, they pass his door without pausing, searching for someone else who hasn't learned, yet that the only way to keep death from collecting your unfinished business is to finish it yourself, one goodbye at a time, spoken whole and true and released into the world, where it can finally stop echoing in the darkness. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain arrived with the kind of patience that suggested it had been waiting for you specifically, as if the clouds had held their breath through the dry weeks, and released it only when you stepped onto the gravel path that led to what the locals still called, with studied casualness, the old sanctuary. The word temple was avoided in the same way people avoided speaking directly about car accidents or terminal diagnoses, as if naming a thing too precisely might summon its full weight into the present moment. The ruin crouched against the hillside like something that had tried to crawl away from its own history and failed partway through the attempt. Water moved over the broken roof in sheets that caught what little light remained in the evening sky, dripping from cornices that had lost their decorative certainty centuries ago, but still remembered the shapes they were meant to hold. The drops fell with metronomic precision, each one landing exactly where the previous 1,000 had landed, wearing shallow bowls into stone that had once been smooth and intentional. You'd brought a torch because the sun was already bleeding out against the western ridge, and because the stories about this place suggested that artificial light was both necessary and insufficient, that there were things here that existed in the gaps between illumination and darkness. The beam caught the first figure while you were still 20 paces from the entrance, and for a moment your rational mind offered the explanation it had been preparing since you decided to come here. Statuary, classical work, probably Hellenistic given the proportions and the quality of the drapery. But then the light held steady, and you noticed details that didn't align with any museum piece you'd ever examined. The stone gleamed as if it had been recently bathed, and when you moved closer, close enough that your breath reached the carved surface, you could have sworn you felt warmth radiating back, the kind of heat that comes from a living body rather than sun-warmed marble. The bronze shard you carried, a fragment of mirror from your grandmother's vanity, broken the night she died while you were 3 states away deciding whether her final phone call warranted the inconvenience of travel, fogged when you held it up to check your reflection. This was normal, explicable, the result of temperature differential and ambient humidity. But when you blinked and looked again, the statue had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way you could point to and say with certainty that it had moved, but closer by some measurement that existed below conscious perception, the way a minute hand advances while you're looking directly at it, but swears it never budged. Water threaded down the statue's cheek in a line too straight to be random drainage, too warm-looking to be simple rain. It moved like sweat on living skin, like the body's desperate attempt to cool itself when fever has taken hold and normal regulation has failed. The legend came to you in pieces, the way folklore always does when you're standing in the place where it allegedly occurred. Your mother had told you a version when you were 12, during that phase when children become fascinated by Greek mythology and can't understand why the adults around them treat these stories with more wariness than wonder. Medusa, she'd said, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone translating between languages that don't share a common grammar, wasn't always a monster. She'd been a temple keeper, a woman whose job was to maintain the sacred space and tend the eternal flame that represented the goddess's continued attention to mortal affairs. But she'd watched too long, your mother had continued, her voice taking on the particular tone that meant she was remembering something she'd been told rather than something she'd read. She'd seen things she wasn't meant to see, witnessed transformations and divine visitations that were supposed to remain private, and she'd failed to look away at the crucial moment when discretion would have saved her. The curse that followed wasn't murder exactly, though that's how the simplified versions told it. It was something more precise and more terrible. Her gaze would harden whatever you refused to face, whatever truth you'd been avoiding, or person you'd been neglecting, or promise you'd been postponing until it was too late to keep. The stone victims she created weren't dead, your mother had explained, and this was the detail that had given you nightmares for months afterward. They were arrested in the moment of avoidance, frozen in the act of turning away, but inside the marble there was still warmth, still consciousness, still the ember of whatever they had been trying to ignore. The serpents that replaced Medusa's hair were oaths that had been broken, each one carrying the name of someone who'd been failed or forgotten, and they remembered everything with the perfect recall of creatures that existed outside normal time. The version you'd heard later, pieced together from academic papers and obscure commentaries, added the detail that made you finally decide to come here. If you entered the ruin on a rain night, the only way to see dawn was to keep your eyes open and speak the names you'd once turned away from. Failure meant something worse than petrification. It meant your reflection would decide somewhere during those dark hours that it had better options than returning to you, that it could find another face to wear or simply dissipate into the collective pool of unattached images that haunted mirrors and still water. You crossed the threshold with the kind of deliberate slowness that people use when approaching wild animals or unstable explosives, as if sudden movement might trigger something irrevocable. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, a common feature of sacred architecture where the goal was to create a sense of impossible space, of having stepped outside normal geometry into a realm governed by different rules. Drips echoed with the precision of slow clocks, each one marking time in a rhythm that had nothing to do with seconds or minutes, but measured something older and more patient. With each blink, and you tried to control them, tried to extend the intervals, but the eye has its own requirements and will not be denied indefinitely. The ring of figures around you tightened. You recognized them, though recognition came slowly, filtered through the years and the self-protective forgetting you'd practiced until it became automatic. There was Marcus Chen, your neighbour from the apartment building where you'd lived during graduate school, who'd knocked on your door 3 times asking if you'd seen his cat, and you'd pretended not to be home because you were tired and didn't want to spend an evening searching dark alleys. The cat had been found dead 2 days later, and Marcus had moved out the following month, and you told yourself it wasn't your fault, that you had no obligation to sacrifice your time for someone else's pet. Behind him stood Professor Hargrove, who'd written you a recommendation letter when you'd applied for the fellowship that launched your career, and who'd sent you an invitation to her retirement dinner 7 years later, and you'd meant to respond, had drafted the email multiple times, but somehow it had never moved from intention to action, and 2 months after that she died of the cancer she hadn't mentioned in the invitation, because she didn't want to make her celebration about her mortality. Further back, barely visible in the torch's wavering light, you could make out the figure of Claire Rodriguez, your closest friend from college, who'd called you 17 times during her divorce, and you'd answered the first 3 and then started letting them go to voicemail because her grief was exhausting, and you had your own problems and eventually the calls had stopped, and when you'd tried to reconnect 5 years later, her number was disconnected and her social media accounts had been deleted, and it was as if she'd erased herself from the world, rather than continue existing in a space where people like you could fail her so completely. The bronze shard showed you something that made your hands go cold despite the warm rain. Your reflection appeared, but lagging, arriving a beat after you moved, as if it was testing whether to remain synchronized with your physical form or drift away entirely. Your face in the bronze looked uncertain, provisional, like an actor who'd forgotten their lines and was waiting to see if the audience would notice the improvisation. Along the floor, barely visible in the guttering torchlight, a trail of shed scales pointed deeper into the ruin. They gleamed with the oily iridescence of healthy serpent skin, recently molted, still holding the shape of the body that had worn them. The pattern they made wasn't random. It was deliberate, a breadcrumb trail or a summons leading toward the apse where the altar had once stood and where something was standing now. The serpents' voices came through the rain, sibilant and patient, speaking syllables that your conscious mind couldn't quite pass but your body understood with the deep recognition of prey hearing a predator's approach. They were speaking names, your names, the collection of identities you'd accumulated and discarded, the versions of yourself you'd promised to become and then quietly abandoned when they proved inconvenient or difficult, or required more courage than you'd been willing to muster. A silhouette separated itself from the shadows in the far apse, and you understood with the clarity of absolute certainty that this was Medusa, though she looked nothing like the illustrations in mythology textbooks or the marble busts in museum galleries. She was tall, taller than seemed possible for a human woman, and rain sheened on skin that you couldn't quite see clearly, as if she existed slightly out of phase with the visible spectrum. Her hair moved with independent life, each serpent a distinct personality, a separate consciousness bound into service of a larger purpose. You couldn't see all of her. The torch's light reached her in fragments, illuminating a cheekbone that caught the glow like polished bone, the curve of a throat that suggested both beauty and something that had moved beyond beauty into a category that had no comfortable name, a forearm braced against the cracked altar with fingers that seemed too long and too articulated, as if they'd been designed for tasks human hands couldn't accomplish. The rest of her was fog and shadow bands, geometry that refused to resolve into comprehensible shape no matter how you strained your vision. The statues around you leaned inward, their postures shifting from neutral observation to active listening, as if they were waiting to hear how you would handle this encounter, whether you would manage it better than they had or join them in their warm stone prison. With every involuntary blink, and they were coming faster now, your eyes drying out from the strain of staying open, from the smoke that rose from the torch and the dust that powdered down from the crumbling ceiling, you felt grit accumulating on your lashes, and when you forced your eyes open again, the nearest figure's mouth had opened a fraction more, as if preparing to speak or scream or consume. The serpents in Medusa's hair spoke your own name, but in pieces, deconstructed into component syllables that they distributed among themselves like a meal being shared. One hissed the first sound while another took up the middle, and a third completed it, and hearing your name spoken this way, divided, analysed, possessed by creatures that existed outside your control, was more terrifying than any direct threat could have been. You raised the bronze shard with trembling hands, needing to check your reflection, needing confirmation that you still existed in a form you recognised. The surface showed you your face, but the eyes were wrong, not absent exactly, but replaced by darkness that seemed to extend backward infinitely, as if your skull had become hollow and the space behind your eyes opened onto some vast nothing that predated consciousness. The memory of the legend's final detail arrived like a life preserver thrown to a drowning person. To move past her, you must name what you refused, clearly whole, placed. Not just the names of the people you'd failed, but the specific moments of failure, the circumstances and the choices and the small cowardices that had seemed so reasonable at the time, but had accumulated into a weight that brought you here, to this ruin, on this rain night, seeking something you couldn't quite articulate. You fixed your eyes on a point just to the side of Medusa's face, focusing on the darkness behind her shoulder rather than risking direct contact with whatever power lived in her gaze. The serpents hissed disapproval, wanting you to look fully, to face what you'd come here to face. But you held your focus on that safe shadow and began to speak. "Marcus Chen," you said, and your voice cracked from disuse and fear and the dryness in your throat. "Fourth floor apartment, building 713 on Maple Street, Tuesday, October 9th, evening rain, unseasonably cold." You knocked 3 times and I was 20 feet from the door, close enough to hear everything you said about your cat being missing since morning, about how she never stayed out after dark, about how you were worried she'd been hit by a car. I pretended not to be home because I was tired, and because I'd just broken up with someone, and because I'd decided that other people's grief was something I couldn't afford to carry. The cat died alone in a storm drain 3 blocks away. If I'd helped you search, we might have found her. The statue of Marcus, and you could see him clearly now, could recognise the particular way he'd held his shoulders, slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller and less intrusive, began to warm. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense, but actually generating heat that you could feel radiating outward, as if something frozen inside the stone was thawing. He took a step backward, not dramatically, but with the slow precision of someone remembering how to move after long imprisonment. The distance between you increased by exactly the width of a heartbeat. You continued, forcing yourself to meet each name with the full weight of memory, to place each failure in its specific context of time and weather and the small, selfish calculations that had seemed so justified. Professor Hargrove's retirement dinner at the Riverside Inn, May 14th, that particular quality of spring evening light that makes everything look possible, and your decision that attending would be awkward because you hadn't kept in touch and she probably didn't even remember you anyway, which was a lie you told yourself to avoid the discomfort of showing up and being reminded of how you drifted away from someone who'd believed in you. Claire's 17th phone call, the one that came at 2 in the morning on a Friday and you were awake, was staring at your phone screen as it lit up with her name, and you'd thought about answering. had even reached for the phone, but then you'd thought about how long the conversation would be, how much emotional labour it would require, how you'd probably have to talk her down from some crisis that felt enormous to her, but would seem smaller in the morning, and you'd let it go to voicemail, and that was the last time she'd called. And 6 months later you'd heard through mutual friends that she'd moved across the country and changed her name and was starting over without the weight of old relationships dragging behind her. For each name you spoke, you added place, weather, time, and a promise of repair small enough to keep. Not grand gestures or impossible redemptions, but specific actions you could actually complete. You would donate to the animal shelter in Marcus's cat's name. You would endow a small scholarship at the university in Professor Hargrove's memory. You would write a letter to Claire's last known address, not expecting response, but offering the apology that should have come years ago, acknowledging the failure without demanding forgiveness. The serpents in Medusa's hair began to quiet, their hissing softening into something that might have been approval, or might have been the sound of oaths being recorded and witnessed. One of them extended toward you, moving with the slow deliberation of a creature that existed outside normal time, and it laid a shed strand across your palm, payment due and proof kept, a physical reminder that these promises had been spoken and heard and would be held against you if you failed to keep them. Your eyes were streaming now, tears and rain and the accumulated moisture of refusing to blink mixing together until your vision blurred and swam. But you kept them open, counting in your head with the rhythm of the rain's drip. 1, open, 2, open, 3, open, timing your blinks to the spaces between drops, never letting your lids close for more than the fraction of a second that separated one moment from the next. The statues continued their slow warming, their gradual retreat, until the aisle was clear again, and you could see the path that led toward the entrance, toward the world beyond this rain-soaked confession. Medusa remained in the apse, but she was turning away, or perhaps simply fading back into the shadows that were her natural habitat. Her work complete for this night, her serpents satisfied that the names had been spoken and the promises recorded. You walked backward toward the entrance, unwilling to turn your back on her, even though you understood that the danger had passed, that you'd met the requirements and earned safe passage. Your reflection in the bronze shard arrived on time now, synchronized with your movements, your eyes looking back from the same moment you stood in. The lag had disappeared, and whatever test you'd been undergoing was apparently complete. The aisle showed wet footprints when you glanced down, curving away into the columns like the exit of a quiet crowd that had been watching your confession and had now dispersed to whatever realm they inhabited between visitations. The statues you'd named had returned to their positions, but they looked different now, less like prisoners and more like witnesses, as if their purpose here was to observe and remember rather than simply to suffer. You left the strand of shed scales tied to the gate at the entrance, a payment accepted and a contract sealed. In a dry niche beside the doorway, you placed the list of names you'd spoken, written on paper that would last until the next rain came and washed it away, or until someone else arrived and needed to read the evidence that others had passed this test before them. When you stepped outside, dawn was beginning to glaze the ruin with pale gold, though only minutes seemed to have passed since you'd entered. Time moved differently in spaces where promises were extracted and witnessed, where the past refused to stay properly buried and demanded acknowledgement before it would allow you to continue forward. You walked back down the gravel path, your torch guttering out now that daylight was arriving, the bronze shard heavy in your pocket with the weight of proof and reminder. When the rain returned, and it would return because this place existed in a pocket of weather that had nothing to do with meteorology and everything to do with the need for cleansing and witness, you would read the names aloud before you blinked, would speak them into the rain as if the water could carry them back to the people you'd failed, could somehow transmit the apology and the promise across whatever distance or death separated you. The stone keeps warmth for those who mean their words, your grandmother had told you once during one of those late-night conversations, when the dying feel compelled to pass along the truths they've been saving, and you'd thought it was just poetry, just the morphine talking, just another fragment of folklore that had no bearing on the practical world. But now, with the serpent scale pressing against your palm and your reflection finally synchronized with your body and the names fresh on your tongue, you understood what she'd meant. The stone remembered what flesh forgot, the heat of intention, the temperature of the honest promise, The warmth that proved you'd meant what you said when speaking seemed easier than silence. You would keep the promises, not because you feared returning to the ruin, though you did fear it with the kind of primal terror that lives below rational thought, but because the alternative was becoming the kind of person who could speak names with full knowledge and still turn away. The statues had shown you what that looked like. Warm stone holding consciousness that couldn't escape. Awareness trapped inside marble that remembered being flesh, but could never return to it. The village at the bottom of the hill was waking as you passed through, shopkeepers opening their shutters and early workers heading toward the bus stop, and they nodded to you with the careful neutrality of people who knew where you'd been and what you'd done but understood that some experiences couldn't be discussed directly. You'd joined a long tradition of visitors who'd climbed that path in the rain, seeking something they couldn't name, and you'd returned, which meant you'd succeeded, which meant you'd earned the right to carry the weight of your promises forward into whatever years remained. The bronze shard stayed in your pocket, a constant reminder against your thigh as you walked, and when you passed reflective surfaces, shop windows, puddles, the side mirror of a parked car, your reflection arrived exactly when it should, synchronized and present, choosing to remain yours because you'd proven yourself worthy of keeping it. The lag was gone, the uncertainty resolved, and what remained was simply you, marked and witnessed, carrying names that would not permit forgetting. The rain arrived with the kind of patience that suggested it had been waiting for you specifically, as if the clouds had held their breath through the dry weeks, and released it only when you stepped onto the gravel path that led to what the locals still called, with studied casualness, the old sanctuary. The word temple was avoided in the same way people avoided speaking directly about car accidents or terminal diagnoses, as if naming a thing too precisely might summon its full weight into the present moment. The ruin crouched against the hillside like something that had tried to crawl away from its own history and failed partway through the attempt. Water moved over the broken roof in sheets that caught what little light remained in the evening sky, dripping from cornices that had lost their decorative certainty centuries ago, but still remembered the shapes they were meant to hold. The drops fell with metronomic precision, each one landing exactly where the previous 1,000 had landed, wearing shallow bowls into stone that had once been smooth and intentional. You'd brought a torch because the sun was already bleeding out against the western ridge, and because the stories about this place suggested that artificial light was both necessary and insufficient, that there were things here that existed in the gaps between illumination and darkness. The beam caught the first figure while you were still 20 paces from the entrance, and for a moment your rational mind offered the explanation it had been preparing since you decided to come here. Statuary, classical work, probably Hellenistic given, the proportions and the quality of the drapery. But then the light held steady, and you noticed details that didn't align with any museum piece you'd ever examined. The stone gleamed as if it had been recently bathed, and when you moved closer, close enough that your breath reached the carved surface, you could have sworn you felt warmth radiating back, the kind of heat that comes from a living body rather than sun-warmed marble. The bronze shard you carried, a fragment of mirror from your grandmother's vanity, broken the night she died while you were 3 states away deciding whether her final phone call warranted the inconvenience of travel, fogged when you held it up to check your reflection. This was normal, explicable, the result of temperature differential and ambient humidity. But when you blinked and looked again, the statue had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way you could point to and say with certainty that it had moved, but closer by some measurement that existed below conscious perception, the way a minute hand advances while you're looking directly at it, but swears it never budged. Water threaded down the statue's cheek in a line too straight to be random drainage, too warm-looking to be simple rain. It moved like sweat on living skin, like the body's desperate attempt to cool itself when fever has taken hold, and normal regulation has failed. The legend came to you in pieces, the way folklore always does when you're standing in the place where it allegedly occurred. Your mother had told you a version when you were 12, during that phase when children become fascinated by Greek mythology and can't understand why the adults around them treat these stories with more wariness than wonder. Medusa, she'd said, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone translating, between languages that don't share a common grammar, wasn't always a monster. She'd been a temple keeper, a woman whose job was to maintain the sacred space and tend the eternal flame that represented the goddess's continued attention to mortal affairs. But she'd watched too long, your mother had continued, her voice taking on the particular tone that meant she was remembering something she'd been told rather than something she'd read. She'd seen things she wasn't meant to see, witnessed transformations and divine visitations that were supposed to remain private, and she'd failed to look away at the crucial moment when discretion would have saved her. The curse that followed wasn't murder exactly, though that's how the simplified versions told it. It was something more precise and more terrible. Her gaze would harden whatever you refused to face, whatever truth you'd been avoiding, or person you'd been neglecting, or promise you'd been postponing until it was too late to keep. The stone victims she created weren't dead, your mother had explained, and this was the detail that had given you nightmares for months afterward. They were arrested in the moment, of avoidance frozen in the act of turning away, but inside the marble there was still warmth, still consciousness, still the ember of whatever they'd been trying to ignore. The serpents that replaced Medusa's hair were oaths that had been broken, each one carrying the name of someone who'd been failed or forgotten, and they remembered everything with the perfect recall of creatures that existed outside normal time. The version you'd heard later, pieced together from academic papers and obscure commentaries, added the detail that made you finally decide to come here. If you entered the ruin on a rain night, the only way to see dawn was to keep your eyes open and speak the names you'd once turned away from. Failure meant something worse than petrification. It meant your reflection would decide somewhere during those dark hours that it had better options than returning to you, that it could find another face to wear or simply dissipate into the collective pool of unattached images that haunted mirrors and still water. You crossed the threshold with the kind of deliberate slowness that people use when approaching wild animals or unstable explosives, as if sudden movement might trigger something irrevocable. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, a common feature of sacred architecture where the goal was to create a sense of impossible space, of having stepped outside normal geometry into a realm governed by different rules. Drips echoed with the precision of slow clocks, each one marking time in a rhythm that had nothing to do with seconds or minutes, but measured something older and more patient. With each blink, and you tried to control them, tried to extend the intervals, but the eye has its own requirements and will not be denied indefinitely. The ring of figures around you tightened. You recognized them, though recognition came slowly, filtered through the years and the self-protective forgetting you'd practiced until it became automatic. There was Marcus Chen, your neighbour from the apartment building where you'd lived during graduate school, who'd knocked on your door 3 times asking if you'd seen his cat, and you'd pretended not to be home because you were tired and didn't want to spend an evening searching dark alleys. The cat had been found dead 2 days later, and Marcus had moved out the following month, and you told yourself it wasn't your fault, that you had no obligation to sacrifice your time for someone else's pet. Behind him stood Professor Hargrove, who'd written you a recommendation letter when you'd applied for the fellowship that launched your career, and who'd sent you an invitation to her retirement dinner 7 years later, and you'd meant to respond, had drafted the email multiple times, but somehow it had never moved from intention to action, and 2 months after that she'd died of the cancer she hadn't mentioned in the invitation, because she didn't want to make her celebration about her mortality. Further back, barely visible in the torch's wavering light, you could make out the figure of Claire Rodriguez, your closest friend from college, who'd called you 17 times during her divorce, and you'd answered the first 3, and then started letting them go to voicemail because her grief was exhausting, and you had your own problems, and eventually the calls had stopped, and when you'd tried to reconnect 5 years later, her number was disconnected, and her social media accounts had been deleted, and it was as if she'd erased herself from the world rather than continue existing in a space where people like you could fail her so completely. The bronze shard showed you something that made your hands go cold despite the warm rain. Your reflection appeared, but lagging, arriving a beat after you moved, as if it was testing whether to remain synchronized with your physical form or drift away entirely. Your face in the bronze looked uncertain, provisional, like an actor who'd forgotten their lines and was waiting to see if the audience would notice the improvisation. Along the floor, barely visible in the guttering torchlight, a trail of shed scales pointed deeper into the ruin. They gleamed with the oily iridescence of healthy serpent skin, recently molted, still holding the shape of the body that had worn them. The pattern they made wasn't random. It was deliberate, a breadcrumb trail or a summons leading toward the apse where the altar had once stood and where something was standing now. The serpents' voices came through the rain, sibilant and patient, speaking syllables that your conscious mind couldn't quite pass, but your body understood with the deep recognition of prey hearing a predator's approach. They were speaking names. Your names, the collection of identities you'd accumulated and discarded, the versions of yourself you'd promised to become, and then quietly abandoned when they proved inconvenient or difficult, or required more courage than you'd been willing to muster. As you moved deeper into the temple, the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming something you had to push through rather than simply breathe. Each step required conscious effort, as if the space between you and the apse was expanding even as you walked forward, a corridor that stretched and contracted according to rules you hadn't learned. The torch flame bent at unnatural angles, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, and you noticed that some of the shadows had faces, not the faces of the statues around you, but older faces, more worn, as if they'd been waiting here far longer than the stone figures that marked more recent failures. Between the recognizable statues stood others, whose features had been smoothed by time or weather, or the accumulated weight of forgotten names. These were the ancient failures, the people who'd been turned away from so long ago that even their identities had eroded, leaving only the shape of human form and the suggestion of the warmth that still lived inside the stone. You wondered how long consciousness persisted in that state, whether it was a mercy to eventually lose even the memory of who you'd been, or whether that loss was its own particular horror, worse than the imprisonment because it meant you'd been failed twice, once by the living who'd turned away, and again by time itself, which had erased even the possibility of future recognition. A silhouette separated itself from the shadows in the far apse, and you understood with the clarity of absolute certainty that this was Medusa, though she looked nothing like the illustrations in mythology textbooks or the marble busts in museum galleries. She was tall, taller than seemed possible for a human woman, and rain-sheened on skin that you couldn't quite see clearly, as if she existed slightly out of phase with the visible spectrum. Her hair moved with independent life, each serpent a distinct personality, a separate consciousness bound into service of a larger purpose. You couldn't see all of her. The torch's light reached her in fragments, illuminating a cheekbone that caught the glow like polished bone, the curve of a throat that suggested both beauty and something that had moved beyond beauty into a category that had no comfortable name, a forearm braced against the cracked altar with fingers that seemed too long and too articulated, as if they'd been designed for tasks human hands couldn't accomplish. The rest of her was fog and shadow bands, geometry that refused to resolve into comprehensible shape, no matter how you strained your vision. The statues around you leaned inward, their postures shifting from neutral observation to active listening, as if they were waiting to hear how you would handle this encounter, whether you would manage it better than they had, or join them in their warm stone prison. With every involuntary blink, and they were coming faster now, your eyes drying out from the strain of staying open, from the smoke that rose from the torch, and the dust that powdered down from the crumbling ceiling. You felt grit accumulating on your lashes, and when you forced your eyes open again, the nearest figure's mouth had opened a fraction more, as if preparing to speak or scream or consume. The serpents in Medusa's hair spoke your own name, but in pieces, deconstructed into component syllables that they distributed among themselves like a meal being shared. One hissed the first sound while another took up the middle and a third completed it, and hearing your name spoken this way, divided, analysed, possessed by creatures that existed outside your control, was more terrifying than any direct threat could have been. You raised the bronze shard with trembling hands, needing to check your reflection, needing confirmation that you still existed in a form you recognized. The surface showed you your face, but the eyes were wrong. Not absent exactly, but replaced by darkness that seemed to extend backward infinitely, as if your skull had become hollow, and the space behind your eyes opened onto some vast nothing that predated consciousness. Behind you, you heard movement that wasn't the settling of old stone or the drip of rain. When you risked a glance, keeping Medusa in your peripheral vision, never looking directly away, you saw that the statues had formed a tighter circle, and now you could see new figures among them. Your brother, who'd asked you to co-sign a loan when his business was failing, and you'd said you couldn't because of your own financial situation. Which was true but also convenient, and he'd lost everything and you'd lost him, not to death but to the kind of resentment that's harder to bridge than mortality. Your first serious partner, who'd needed you to stay one extra week to help with their mother's funeral arrangements, and you'd had a work conference that seemed important at the time, and when you'd returned you'd found their apartment empty and a note that said simply, "I understand now what I mean to you." There were others, pushing up through the floor like plants seeking light, figures you'd managed to forget entirely until this moment forced you to remember. The elderly man who'd collapsed on the subway platform while you were running late to a meeting, and you'd seen other people stopping to help, so you'd told yourself your assistance wasn't needed, and you'd learned 3 days later from a news article that he'd died because the response time had been too slow, because not enough people had stopped, because everyone had assumed someone else would handle it. The teenager who'd been sobbing in the parking garage, and you'd heard them but kept walking because getting involved in someone else's crisis felt dangerous, felt like opening a door that might never close, and 2 weeks later there'd been a memorial service and whispers about warning signs that had been missed. The memory of the legend's final detail arrived like a life preserver thrown to a drowning person. To move past her, you must name what you refused. Clearly, whole, placed. Not just the names of the people you'd failed, but the specific moments of failure, the circumstances and the choices, and the small cowardices that had seemed so reasonable at the time but had accumulated into a weight that brought you here, to this ruin, on this rain night, seeking something you couldn't quite articulate. You fixed your eyes on a point just to the side of Medusa's face, focusing on the darkness behind her shoulder rather than risking direct contact with whatever power lived in her gaze. The serpents hissed disapproval, wanting you to look fully, to face what you'd come here to face, but you held your focus on that safe shadow and began to speak. "Marcus Chen," you said, and your voice cracked from disuse and fear and the dryness in your throat. "4th floor apartment, building 713 on Maple Street, Tuesday, October 9th, evening rain, unseasonably cold. You knocked 3 times and I was 20 feet from the door, close enough to hear everything you said about your cat being missing since morning, about how she never stayed out after dark, about how you were worried she'd been hit by a car. I pretended not to be home because I was tired and because I'd just broken up with someone and because I'd decided that other people's grief was something I couldn't afford to carry. The cat died alone in a storm drain 3 blocks away. If I'd helped you search, we might have found her. The statue of Marcus, and you could see him clearly now, could recognize the particular way he'd held his shoulders, slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller and less intrusive, began to warm. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense, but actually generating heat that you could feel radiating outward, as if something frozen inside the stone was thawing. He took a step backward, not dramatically, but with the slow precision of someone remembering how to move after long imprisonment. The distance between you increased by exactly the width of a heartbeat. You continued, forcing yourself to meet each name with the full weight of memory, to place each failure in its specific context of time and weather and the small selfish calculations that had seemed so justified. Professor Hargrove's retirement dinner at the Riverside Inn, May 14th, that particular quality of spring evening light that makes everything look possible, and your decision that attending would be awkward because you hadn't kept in touch, and she probably didn't even remember you anyway, which was a lie you told yourself to avoid the discomfort of showing up and being reminded of how you drifted away from someone who'd believed in you. Claire's 17th phone call, the one that came at 2 a.m. on a Friday and you were awake, was staring at your phone screen as it lit up with her name, and you'd thought about answering, had even reached for the phone, but then you'd thought about how long the conversation would be, how much emotional labour it would require, how you'd probably have to talk her down from some crisis that felt enormous to her, but would seem smaller in the morning, and you'd let it go to voicemail, and that was the last time she'd called, and 6 months later you'd heard through mutual friends that she'd moved across the country and changed her name, and was starting over without the weight of old relationships dragging behind her. The words came faster now, as if something had broken loose inside you, some dam that had been holding back not just these specific memories, but the entire accumulated weight of small abandonments and calculated avoidances that had shaped your life. Your brother David at the kitchen table of your parents' house, Sunday afternoon in November, asking if you'd help him with the loan paperwork, and you'd been checking your phone while he talked, already planning your excuse, already deciding that his problems were the result of his own poor choices and you had no obligation to enable his mistakes. The business had failed 6 months later, and he'd moved to another state, and your parents had never said anything directly, but you'd noticed how the family gatherings had changed, how there was now a David-shaped absence that everyone pretended not to notice. your former partner Jordan sitting on the edge of their bed at 3 a.m, explaining that their mother was dying and they needed you to postpone the conference, to stay just one more week, and you'd been thinking about the networking opportunities you'd miss, about how this would look to your department chair, about whether this relationship was really serious enough to warrant that kind of sacrifice, and you'd made it about logistics and timing when really it had been about priority, about revealing through your actions what Jordan meant to you, or rather what they didn't mean, and when you'd come back from the conference their things were gone, and you'd told yourself it was better this way, that the relationship probably wouldn't have lasted anyway, that you'd dodge some future complication by discovering the incompatibility now rather than later. For each name you spoke, you added place, weather, time, and a promise of repair small enough to keep. Not grand gestures or impossible redemptions, but specific actions you could actually complete. You would donate to the animal shelter in Marcus's cat's name. You would endow a small scholarship at the university in Professor Hargrove's memory. You would write a letter to Claire's last known address, not expecting response, but offering the apology that should have come years ago, acknowledging the failure without demanding forgiveness. But the promises to your brother and to Jordan required more thought, more precision. You couldn't simply write a check or establish a fund. These were living people whose lives you'd materially affected, whose absence from your world was a direct result of your choices. For David, you promised to call him, to have the conversation you should have had years ago, to acknowledge that you'd failed him when he'd needed help, and that your failure had been rooted not in reasonable caution, but in judgment and dismissal. You promised to ask what kind of relationship he wanted now, if any, and to accept whatever answer he gave without argument or justification. For Jordan, you promised to write not a letter, but a proper apology, one that acknowledged the specific harm you'd caused, that didn't make excuses or explain away your choices with reference to career pressures or personal circumstances. You promised to admit that you'd chosen professional advancement over their mother's death, that you'd revealed through that choice exactly how little they meant to you, and that this was your failure, not theirs, not the relationships, but yours alone. The serpents in Medusa's hair began to quiet, their hissing softening into something that might have been approval, or might have been the sound of oaths being recorded and witnessed. One of them extended toward you, moving with the slow deliberation of a creature that existed outside normal time, and it laid a shed strand across your palm, payment due and proof kept, a physical reminder that these promises had been spoken and heard and would be held against you if you failed to keep them. But you weren't finished. The harder names remained, the ones you'd buried so deep that even preparing for this night hadn't fully excavated them. The elderly man on the subway platform, whose name you'd never learned but whose face you'd seen in the news photograph, Herbert Chen, according to the article, 73 years old, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Washington Street Station, Monday morning rush, October cold, and you'd been running late for a meeting that seemed important until you'd learned it had been rescheduled anyway, until you'd realised that nothing discussed in that conference room had mattered enough to justify stepping over someone's medical emergency. The teenager in the parking garage, whose name you'd also never learned but whose memorial page you'd found, after searching local obituaries with guilty desperation, Maya Restrepo, 16 years old, honour student, varsity soccer player, daughter, sister, friend to dozens who'd posted anguished messages about missed signs and lost chances. Underground parking level 3, Tuesday evening in March, and you'd heard sobbing that echoed off concrete walls and you'd walked faster instead of slower. Had gotten in your car and driven away while telling yourself that teenagers were dramatic, that someone else who knew them would provide better help, that you had dinner plans and were already running late. For Herbert Chen, you promised to volunteer at the community first aid training program, to become the kind of person who knew what to do in an emergency, rather than hoping someone else would handle it. For Maya Restrepo, you promised to donate to the crisis hotline she'd called 3 times in the week before her death, and to train as a volunteer responder to become someone who answered rather than ignored, who stayed on the line rather than rushing to the next thing on their schedule. The naming took hours or minutes. You couldn't tell which, because time had stopped functioning normally. The rain continued its steady drip, but the sound no longer marked progression, only presence. Your eyes were streaming now, tears and rain, and the accumulated moisture of refusing to blink mixing together, until your vision blurred and swam. But you kept them open, counting in your head with the rhythm of the rain's drip. 1, open. 2, open. 3. Open, timing your blinks to the spaces between drops, never letting your lids close for more than the fraction of a second that separated one moment from the next. The statues continued their slow warming, their gradual retreat, until the aisle was clear again and you could see the path that led toward the entrance, toward the world beyond this rain-soaked confession. But before you could move, before you could consider whether the trial was complete, Medusa spoke for the first time, and her voice was nothing like you'd expected. It wasn't monstrous or terrifying, but profoundly sad, weighted with centuries of witnessing failure after failure, of cataloguing human cowardice in all its small and large expressions. "The names you speak are only the ones you remember," she said, and each word arrived with the precision of a sculptor's chisel. "What of those you've forgotten? What of the failures so complete that even memory rejected them?" The question stopped you like a physical barrier. You'd named everyone you could recall, had excavated every buried shame and unacknowledged abandonment your conscience could access. But she was right, of course. Memory was selective, protective. How many others had there been? How many people had you turned away from with such efficiency that your mind had refused to catalogue the interaction? How many small cruelties had seemed so justified, so reasonable, so necessary that they'd never registered as failures at all? "I don't remember," you said, and the admission felt like another kind of failure, perhaps the deepest kind. "I can't name what I've forgotten." "Then name what you fear," Medusa replied, moving closer now, though you still couldn't see her fully, still perceived her only in fragments and suggestions. "Name the person you're becoming if you continue turning away. Give that future self a place and time and promise what you'll do to prevent their arrival." This was harder than naming the past because it required imagining a future you'd been carefully avoiding, a trajectory you'd been on without fully acknowledging its destination. You saw yourself at 50, at 60, at 70, having perfected the art of avoidance, having built a life where no one could make demands because no one was close enough to try. You saw the comfortable isolation you'd been constructing, the walls you'd been building from polite excuses and reasonable boundaries and legitimate professional obligations, until you'd created a fortress where nothing could hurt you because nothing could reach you. "I will become someone who attends no funerals because they've outlived all their connections," you said, and your voice broke on the words, "I will become someone who dies alone not because they were unloved, but because they were never present enough to be loved properly. I will become someone whose obituary lists accomplishments but no relationships, professional milestones but no moments of genuine human connection. This will happen gradually, imperceptibly, through 1,000 small choices that seem reasonable in isolation, but accumulate into absolute loneliness. You place this future self at the kitchen table of whatever sterile apartment you'd be living in on a Tuesday evening because Tuesday had become the same as every other day, with takeout containers because cooking for one had long since seemed pointless, and you promised to intervene. You promised to say yes more often than no, to show up more often than you stayed away, to choose connection over convenience even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was inconvenient, even when every rational calculation suggested that protecting yourself was smarter than risking yourself. The serpents in Medusa's hair had gone completely quiet now, and in the silence you could hear something else, a sound like distant singing, or weeping, or perhaps both at once. The statues were retreating to their original positions, their stone faces relaxing from the particular tension that had marked them as prisoners into something more neutral, more accepting. The warmth radiating from them began to fade, not disappearing but settling into something sustainable, something that could be maintained across years rather than burning out in a single night of confession. Medusa turned away, or rather dissolved back into the shadows that had birthed her, and you understood that the trial was complete, that you'd spoken what needed to be spoken and heard what needed to be heard. Your reflection in the bronze shard arrived on time now, synchronized with your movements, your eyes looking back from the same moment you stood in. The lag had disappeared, and whatever test you'd been undergoing was apparently complete. The aisle showed wet footprints when you glanced down, curving away into the columns like the exit of a quiet crowd that had been watching your confession and had now dispersed to whatever realm they inhabited between visitations. The statues you'd named had returned to their positions, but they looked different now, less like prisoners and more like witnesses, as if their purpose here was to observe and remember rather than simply to suffer. You walked backward toward the entrance, unwilling to turn your back on the space even though you understood that the danger had passed, that you'd met the requirements and earned safe passage. The torch was guttering now, its fuel nearly exhausted, and you let it burn out rather than carry dead weight. Dawn was close enough that you could navigate by its approaching light, by the gradual transformation of darkness from absolute to merely dim. You left the strand of shed scales tied to the gate at the entrance, a payment accepted and a contract sealed. In a dry niche beside the doorway, you placed the list of names you'd spoken, written on paper that would last until the next rain came and washed it away, or until someone else arrived and needed to read the evidence that others had passed this test before them. When you stepped outside, dawn was beginning to glaze the ruin with pale gold, though only minutes seemed to have passed since you'd entered. Time moved differently in spaces where promises were extracted and witnessed, where the past refused to stay properly buried and demanded acknowledgement before it would allow you to continue forward. You walked back down the gravel path, your dead torch hanging loose in your hand, the bronze shard heavy in your pocket with the weight of proof and reminder. When the rain returned, and it would return, because this place existed in a pocket of weather that had nothing to do with meteorology and everything to do with the need for cleansing and witness, you would read the names aloud before you blinked, would speak them into the rain as if the water could carry them back to the people you'd failed, could somehow transmit the apology and the promise across whatever distance or death separated you. The stone keeps warmth for those who mean their words, your grandmother had told you once, during one of those late-night conversations when the dying feel compelled to pass along the truths they've been saving, and you'd thought it was just poetry, just the morphine talking, just another fragment of folklore that had no bearing on the practical world. But now, with the serpent scale pressing against your palm, and your reflection finally synchronized with your body, and the names fresh on your tongue, you understood what she'd meant. The stone remembered what flesh forgot, the heat of intention, the temperature of honest promise, the warmth that proved you'd meant what you said when speaking seemed easier than silence. You would keep the promises, not because you feared returning to the ruin, though you did fear it with the kind of primal terror that lives below rational thought, but because the alternative was becoming the kind of person who could speak names with full knowledge and still turn away. The statues had shown you what that looked like. Warm stone holding consciousness that couldn't escape, awareness trapped inside marble that remembered being flesh but could never return to it. The village at the bottom of the hill was waking as you passed through, shopkeepers opening their shutters and early workers heading toward the bus stop, and they nodded to you with the careful neutrality of people who knew where you'd been and what you'd done, but understood that some experiences couldn't be discussed directly. You'd joined a long tradition of visitors who'd climbed that path in the rain, seeking something they couldn't name, and you'd returned, which meant you'd succeeded, which meant you'd earned the right to carry the weight of your promises forward into whatever years remained. The bronze shard stayed in your pocket, a constant reminder against your thigh as you walked, and when you passed reflective surfaces, shop windows, puddles, the side mirror of a parked car, your reflection arrived exactly when it should, synchronized and present, choosing to remain yours because you'd proven yourself worthy of keeping it. The lag was gone, the uncertainty, resolved, and what remained was simply you, marked and witnessed, carrying names that would not permit forgetting. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The silence arrived first, the way it always does in deep winter when the snow falls thick enough to muffle the world into something that feels less like landscape and more like held breath. Sarah Mallory stood at her kitchen window watching the white descent, each flake so fine it seemed less like precipitation and more like the air itself deciding to become visible, to show you exactly how much emptiness surrounded you out here, where the tree line pressed close and the nearest neighbour lived 3 miles down a road that disappeared for weeks at a time once the real cold settled in. She'd been watching the snow for perhaps 20 minutes, though time had that elastic quality it acquired during storms, stretching and contracting according to rhythms that had nothing to do with clocks. The window glass was cold enough that her breath ghosted across it, in patches that faded and reformed with each exhalation, creating temporary maps of moisture that looked almost like something was trying to communicate through the condensation. Though of course, that was just her mind doing what minds do in isolation, finding patterns where none existed. The firewood was running lower than she'd anticipated. She'd counted the split logs that morning, stacked against the north wall of the cabin in careful rows that represented her calculations about how long the winter would last, how cold it would get, how many hours of burning would be required to keep the small space habitable. The mathematics of survival in a place like this were precise and unforgiving, admitting no miscalculation, no optimistic rounding of figures. Yet when she counted again, after the snow had been falling for several hours, the stack seemed to have diminished more than it should have, as if each log was burning faster than wood had any right to burn, consuming itself with an efficiency that defied the physical properties she understood fire to possess. The cabin had belonged to her grandfather, one of those men who'd understood remoteness not as isolation, but as a kind of careful insulation from the world's various demands and complications. He'd built it himself over the course of 2 summers in the 1960s, hauling materials up the logging road that still existed then, before the company pulled out and the forest began its patient work of reclaiming what civilization had briefly borrowed. Sarah had inherited it along with his journals, his tool collection, and his apparently genetic preference for spaces where human voices were rare enough to seem remarkable when they occurred. She'd come here in October, telling her friends in Portland that she needed time to work on her novel, though the truth was simpler and more difficult to articulate. She'd needed to be somewhere that didn't contain the accumulated weight of her previous life, the apartment where she and Michael had lived before the accident, the streets where she might encounter people who would offer condolences with that particular tone that combined sympathy with relief that tragedy had visited someone else's house rather than their own. Grief, she'd discovered, was something you couldn't outrun, but you could at least choose the landscape through which it pursued you. The winter had arrived early and stayed late, which the old-timers in the village 12 miles south had mentioned with the kind of knowing satisfaction that suggested they'd predicted exactly this outcome, that they understood winter's rhythms in ways that weather services and meteorological instruments could never capture. She'd driven down once in November to resupply, her truck handling the deteriorating road with the grudging competence of machinery, built before computers told engines how to think, and the man at the general store had looked at her purchases, flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, batteries, with an expression that might have been approval, or might have been something else entirely. "You planning to winter up there alone?" he'd asked, not exactly disapproving, but definitely interested in her answer, as if it might reveal something important about her character, or her understanding of what winter meant in this particular region. "That's the idea," she'd said, and he'd nodded slowly, the kind of nod that contained reservations he wasn't going to voice directly. "Keep your woodpile covered," he'd said instead. "And if the radio starts acting funny, don't ignore it. Weather can turn mean up there, mean enough that you'll want warning before it arrives." She'd thanked him and driven back up the deteriorating road, her truck's tyres finding purchase in the frozen ruts, and she'd thought about his comment about the radio, how it contained implications he hadn't bothered to unpack, as if the proper response to those implications should have been self-evident to anyone with the sense to survive a mountain winter alone. The radio sat on the kitchen counter now, a battered transistor model that her grandfather had probably owned since before she was born, its antenna held in place with electrical tape, and what looked like part of a coat hanger. It received 3 stations on good days, their signals arriving intermittently, interrupted by the topography and the weather, and the general unwillingness of electromagnetic radiation to travel reliably through dense forest and steep valleys. Mostly she kept it off, preferring the cabin's natural silence to the intrusion of distant voices discussing events that felt increasingly irrelevant to her current existence. But tonight, with the snow falling and the firewood diminishing, and the silence pressing against the windows with unusual weight, she'd turned it on, adjusting the dial until she found something that resembled music, a country station broadcasting from somewhere in the valley, the singer's voice warped by static into something that sounded less like entertainment and more like a message being delivered through some degraded medium that hadn't quite failed but hadn't quite succeeded either. The music had played for perhaps an hour, interrupted occasionally by advertisements for farm equipment and local businesses, the kind of regional commerce that reminded you how far you were from places where people worried about stock markets and international news. Then, sometime after full dark, the music had stopped mid-song, replaced by a hiss that seemed to contain structure, as if something was trying to speak through the static but couldn't quite organise the noise into language. Sarah had stood at the counter, her hand hovering over the dial, listening to the hiss resolve itself into something that might have been her name, though it was difficult to be certain. The static had a way of suggesting patterns, encouraging the ear to hear what it expected rather than what was actually present. She turned the radio off and stood in the restored silence, telling herself that isolation played tricks on perception, that the mind constructed meaning from randomness when it lacked sufficient external stimulation. That's when she'd noticed the boot rack by the door, the simple wooden structure her grandfather had built to hold winter footwear, keeping the melting snow and ice away from the cabin's interior. She owned 2 pairs of boots suitable for the conditions here, heavy insulated things that transformed walking into an act of deliberate effort, each step requiring conscious commitment. Both pairs sat in their customary positions, but between them, on the slats of the rack, were patches of moisture that suggested other boots had recently occupied that space, their heat and dampness leaving evidence that was already beginning to fade into the dry cabin air. She approached the rack slowly, her sock feet silent on the plank floor, and studied the moisture patterns with the kind of attention you give to things that shouldn't exist. The shapes were definitely boot-sized, with clear indications of heel and toe, but the proportions were wrong somehow, slightly elongated, as if whoever had worn them possessed feet that were almost but not quite human in their dimensions. The moisture was still fresh enough that when she touched it, her finger came away damp and very cold, colder than melted snow should have been after sitting inside for even a few minutes. She checked the door, locked, the deadbolt thrown, the chain engaged. The windows were secured, their latches in place, frost beginning to pattern the glass in fern-like formations that grew more elaborate as she watched. There was no way someone could have entered and removed their boots and departed without leaving more substantial evidence, without making sounds that would have alerted her, without disturbing the cabin's carefully maintained equilibrium of heat and stillness. Unless they hadn't entered at all, unless the boots had been worn by something that didn't require conventional means of passage, something that could manifest its presence without necessarily occupying space in the ways that normal matter occupied space. The thought arrived with the kind of clarity that suggested it had been waiting at the edges of her consciousness, patient and inevitable, and she pushed it away with the same mental force she'd been using to push away grief, refusing to give it space to expand into something that might overwhelm her capacity for rational thought. She needed to check the woodpile, needed to understand why the fire was consuming fuel at such an improbable rate. She pulled on her boots, her actual boots, still damp from her afternoon trip to the shed, and wrapped herself in the heavy coat that smelled of wood smoke and cold storage. The door resisted when she tried to open it, not locked, but somehow stuck, as if the frame had warped slightly, and when it finally yielded, it did so with a sound like something yielding under pressure it hadn't been designed to withstand. The cold outside was immediate and absolute, the kind of cold that felt less like temperature and more like presence, something that wanted to touch every exposed surface, to find its way inside your clothing and make direct contact with skin. Her breath emerged in clouds that seemed to hang in the still air longer than physics suggested they should, as if the cold was so complete that even her exhalations were reluctant to disperse into it. The snow was still falling, those fine crystals that accumulated slowly but persistently, building depth through sheer patience rather than dramatic accumulation. Her footprints from the afternoon were still visible, leading from the cabin door across the small clearing to the woodshed, a distance of perhaps 30 feet that felt much longer in the dark with only the cabin's windows casting weak light across the white expanse. But there were other prints now, overlaying hers, matching them step for step but somehow deeper, as if whatever had made them weighed more than she did, or pressed into the snow with more deliberate force. The stride length was identical to her own, the spacing perfect, but the prints themselves were wrong in the same way the moisture on the boot rack had been wrong, slightly elongated, the heel impression darker and more defined than seemed natural. Sarah stood on the porch, her hand on the doorframe, studying the doubled trail with the kind of focused attention that precluded thought, that operated on pure observation without interpretation. The prints led to the woodshed and returned, just as hers had, but the returning prints were different, heavier on one side, as if whatever had made them was carrying something, bearing additional weight that caused one foot to sink deeper into the snow than the other. She should go back inside, lock the door, wait for daylight. These were the practical thoughts the sensible responses to a situation that defied sensible explanation. Instead, she stepped off the porch, placing her feet carefully in her own earlier prints, feeling how they'd been changed by the weight that had followed them, compressed into something that resembled her trail but contained additional depth, additional pressure. The woodshed door was open, just slightly, enough to admit wind and snow and whatever else might be interested in entering. She was certain she'd closed it properly that afternoon, had pulled it shut against its warped frame, and dropped the simple wooden latch that kept it secured. The latch was up now, lying against the door's exterior as if someone had carefully lifted it rather than forcing entry. Inside, the neatly stacked wood that represented her calculations about winter survival had been disturbed. Not stolen, the volume looked approximately correct, but rearranged as if someone had removed pieces and replaced them in slightly different positions, destroying the careful architecture she'd imposed on the stack. Some of the logs felt colder than they should have, cold enough that touching them stung her palm even through her gloves, as if they'd been somewhere much colder than the shed, somewhere that winter existed in a more concentrated form. She lifted one of the coldest logs, examining it in the dim light that filtered through the shed's single window. The wood was covered in a fine frost that shouldn't have been there, crystalline patterns that seemed to form shapes if you looked at them with sufficient attention, though the shapes dissolved into randomness when you tried to focus on them directly. The bark felt wrong under her gloves, simultaneously brittle and somehow soft, as if the wood had been partially transformed into something that resembled wood, but wasn't quite the same substance anymore. Sarah replaced the log carefully, maintaining the stack's precarious stability, and backed out of the shed into the falling snow. The prints she'd followed here continued past the shed's door, leading deeper into the trees, though her own prints stopped at the entrance. Whatever had walked in her footsteps had then continued on its own trajectory, carrying its weight into the forest where the darkness was absolute, and the snow fell through branches that creaked under accumulating ice. She should not follow those prints. Every survival instinct she possessed, every piece of practical knowledge her grandfather had tried to impart during her childhood visits, insisted that you did not venture into unfamiliar forest at night during a snowstorm, that you maintained your position in known space and waited for conditions to improve. Yet the prints pulled at her attention with the same insistence that grief pulled at memory, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be ignored through simple willpower. The trail led perhaps 50 yards into the trees before it stopped. Not gradually, not with the kind of natural termination you'd expect if someone had simply turned around and retraced their steps, but abruptly, as if whatever had been making the prints had simply ceased to exist in the middle of a stride. The final print was partial, showing only the front half of a boot impression, the heel section simply absent, unfinished, as if the foot had begun to dissolve before completing its step. Sarah stood at the trail's end, her flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness and the white descent that continued with patient indifference to her confusion. The silence here was different from the cabin's silence, heavier somehow, as if the forest was actively absorbing sound rather than simply failing to produce it. Her breathing seemed too loud, her heartbeat too pronounced, as if these biological functions were violations of some protocol the darkness expected her to observe. When she turned to return to the cabin, she saw them. Other prints, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, appearing between the trees in every direction. They emerged from the darkness beyond her flashlight's reach, converging on her position from multiple angles, all of them matching her stride length, all of them bearing that same wrong elongation, that same suggestion of weight that shouldn't exist. The snow around her had become a record of movement that couldn't have occurred, a documented impossibility that her eyes insisted was real, even as her mind rejected the evidence. She ran. There was no dignity in it, no measured retreat or strategic withdrawal, just the pure animal response of fleeing from something that violated fundamental assumptions about how the world operated. Her boots found the original trail through instinct rather than conscious navigation, following her earlier path back toward the cabin, whose windows now seemed impossibly distant, their light weak and uncertain against the pressing dark. Behind her she heard it, a sound like wind through frozen branches, but organized, purposeful, shaped into something that resembled breathing but contained harmonics that breathing shouldn't possess. It moved through the trees parallel to her flight, matching her pace without apparent effort. And beneath the wind-breathing sound came something else, a voice that used her own cadence, her own inflection, speaking words she couldn't quite distinguish, but recognized as her own speech, patterns borrowed and distorted. The cabin door was still open, spilling heat into the cold, and she threw herself through it with enough force that she stumbled, catching herself against the kitchen counter, spinning to slam the door shut and throw both locks and press her weight against the wood, as if her body could reinforce what metal and timber could not. Through the window beside the door she could see her trail, see how it led directly to the threshold, and see how other trails converged on that same point, dozens of them, all terminating at the porch steps. For a long moment nothing happened. The wind continued its work, the snow continued falling, and Sarah stood with her back against the door, her breathing gradually slowing from panic to something approaching normal rhythm. Perhaps she'd imagined it. Perhaps isolation and grief and too many nights alone had combined to produce a hallucination, a waking dream that felt real, but possessed no objective existence outside her own compromised perception. Then came the knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just a simple polite knock, the kind a neighbour might use when visiting, announcing their presence without demanding immediate response. It came again, 3 measured impacts that communicated patience and certainty, and with it came her own voice, speaking from just beyond the door, flat and wind-burned exactly as her voice sounded after hours in the cold. "Open up," the voice said, using her words, her tone, her particular way of pronouncing the vowels. "You're freezing out here." Sarah's hand moved toward the deadbolt before she could stop it, responding to the familiar voice with automatic compliance, the same way you might answer a ringing phone or turn toward your name being called. She caught herself with the bolt halfway released and held there, trapped between the impulse to respond to what sounded like herself and the knowledge that she was inside, warm, that whatever stood beyond the door was using her voice without her permission. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, and now she could hear the slight wrongness in it, the way it emphasized syllables with fractional errors, like an actor who'd learned lines phonetically without quite understanding their meaning. "I walked all the way back from the shed. My feet are numb. Please, Sarah, open the door." The use of her name was what convinced her, finally and completely, that something was catastrophically wrong. She hadn't spoken her own name aloud in weeks, not since she'd been to the village for supplies, not since there'd been another human being present to require that kind of identifier. Whatever stood outside had learned her voice, her speech patterns, but it had made an error in deploying them, had used her name in a context where she would never use it herself. She backed away from the door, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb, and moved to the window, carefully pulling aside the curtain just enough to see the porch. The snow was falling more heavily now, large flakes that accumulated quickly, but through it she could make out a shape standing at the door, tall and impossibly thin, its proportions wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. The limbs were too long, the joints positioned slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to construct a human figure from memory without having clear reference material. The extremities, fingers, the suggestion of feet, were dark, frostbite black against the white surroundings, and the torso possessed a narrowness that suggested starvation pushed beyond any survivable limit. But it was the face that made Sarah drop the curtain and step back, her stomach, lurching with a revulsion that was partly physical and partly something deeper, a spiritual rejection of what she'd seen. The face was mostly white, mostly breath and vapour, with features that appeared and disappeared as the wind shifted, but when they stabilised into visibility they were her features, arranged in an approximation of her face that was perfect enough to be recognisable and imperfect enough to be monstrous. The eyes were the worst part. 2 pale glints that might have been actual eyes, or might have been something else that had learned what eyes were supposed to look like and was doing its best impression. "Sarah," it called again, and the voice had dropped its pretense of normalcy, had allowed something else to bleed through. A quality that was neither male nor female, neither human nor animal, but something that existed in the spaces between those categories. "You know what I need. Just a name. Give me a name and this becomes so much easier." She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Her throat had closed around any possible words, and her mind was racing through everything she'd ever heard about winter in this region, Every story her grandfather had half told before changing the subject. Every warning the man at the general store had delivered in that careful, indirect way. There had been stories, she realised now. Stories she'd dismissed as folklore, colourful regional mythology designed to make tourists feel they were experiencing something authentically remote and dangerous. Stories about the Wendigo, about hunger that learned your shape, about winter taking human form and asking to be fed. Her grandfather had mentioned it once, she remembered now, during one of her childhood visits, before he had been stopped by her grandmother's sharp look and the conversation had been redirected towards safer topics. He'd said something about keeping names close in winter, about how words had power in the deep cold, how you didn't speak the names of people you loved when you were alone because there were things that listened, things that collected names the way you might collect currency, spending them on purposes you wouldn't want to imagine. The scratching started then, a sound like branches dragging across wood, except it was coming from multiple points on the cabin's exterior simultaneously, as if whatever stood outside had grown additional limbs or had called companions to assist in its work. Sarah could hear it circling the cabin, testing windows, probing at the places where the logs met, searching for any gap large enough to admit passage. The fire in the stove was dying, she realised, the flames guttering lower despite having added wood less than an hour ago. The cold was finding its way inside through means she couldn't identify, creating patches of frost on the interior walls, making the air itself feel dense and resistant to breathing. The temperature was dropping with impossible speed, as if the cabin's insulation had simply ceased to function, as if the walls were becoming porous to winter's advance. She moved to the stove and opened its door, intending to add more wood, but stopped when she saw what the flames had revealed. Among the burning logs was something that shouldn't have been there, a shape that looked almost like a hand. Fingers curled in the heat, except it wasn't burning the way wood burned, wasn't being consumed so much as being transformed, turning from solid matter into something that resembled smoke but possessed more substance, more intentionality. Sarah slammed the stove door shut and stumbled backward, nearly falling over the chair she'd positioned by the window that afternoon, back when the world had still made sense, when the most pressing concern had been whether she had sufficient supplies to last until spring. The radio on the counter buzzed to life without her touching it, its speakers crackling with the same structured static she'd heard earlier, except now the static had organised itself into something closer to language, repeating her name with various inflections, trying out different emotional colourings, curiosity, anger, hunger, something that might have been affection if you didn't listen too carefully. The thing outside had stopped its circling. Through the gaps around the doorframe she could see its shadow, elongated and wrong, blocking the weak light from the snow-covered clearing. It was speaking again, but now it was using other voices, voices she recognised, her mother, her sister, Michael's voice asking why she'd left him alone on the road that night, why she hadn't seen the ice, hadn't prevented what couldn't have been prevented. Each voice was perfect in its replication, capturing every nuance and characteristic, and each one asked the same essential question: just give me a name. Just tell me who you miss, who you love, who you'd give anything to see again. She remembered what her grandfather had said, the fragment of instruction before he'd been stopped. Something about embers and counting, about speaking place names instead of people names, about how truth was binding in ways that lies could never be. She moved to the stove, her hands shaking but steady enough to complete the necessary tasks. Inside was a coffee tin, old and dented, that her grandfather had kept for reasons she'd never understood until now. She lifted it carefully and placed it beside the stove, then used the iron poker to fish out several of the brightest coals, embers that glowed with heat that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple combustion. The coals went into the tin, which she carried toward the door, feeling their warmth penetrate the metal and reach her palms. The deadbolt resisted when she tried to release it, as if the cold had already begun to seize the mechanism, but she forced it with determination that surprised her, pulling the door open just wide enough to create a space between inside and outside, between warmth and cold, between what she was and what waited to consume her. The thing stood on the porch, close enough to touch if she'd been foolish enough to extend her hand. This close, she could see how it had assembled itself from winter and hunger, and the shape it had learned from watching her, from studying her movements through the trees, from analysing her footprints and the cadence of her speech. It tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck, and those pale glints that might have been eyes fixed on her with an attention that felt like weight, like pressure, like gravity operating in directions it shouldn't. "Finally," it said, using her voice again, but making no effort now to hide the wrongness underneath. "A name, Sarah, that's all. Just give me one name and you can close the door. You can be warm again. You can sleep. Don't you want to sleep?" She did want to sleep, wanted it with a desperation that made her bones ache, but she understood now that sleep was another kind of surrender, another way of giving this thing permission to continue its work. Instead, she held the tin of embers forward, letting their heat create a boundary between herself and what waited, and began to speak. She counted her steps backward, from where she stood to where she'd started, naming each landmark with the precision of ritual. Threshold, porchboard, step, clearing edge, trail marker, split in the path where ice accumulated, the depression where spring water collected, the birch stump her grandfather had used as a cutting surface, the place where the road curved and you could first see the cabin's roof. Each name was a fact, a true thing, and with each naming she felt the thing recoil slightly, as if truth itself was caustic to whatever it was made of. When she'd traced her path completely, mapped every step from road to door in words that carried no human name, no person it could pursue, she spoke her own hunger into the cold. She named her loneliness, the grief that had driven her to this remote place, the terror that had awakened when she'd seen Michael's car twisted around the tree, the desperate hunger for someone to tell her it wasn't her fault, that there was nothing she could have done. She gave these feelings names, made them concrete and speakable, offered them to the cold as sustenance. The thing leaned toward the ember glow drawn by the heat or by the honesty or by something else entirely. When it became clear she would offer no human names, no souls for it to pursue and consume, it seemed to collapse slightly, its impossible height diminishing, its borrowed features losing cohesion. It reached for the tin she'd placed at the threshold's edge, where the warmth ended and the cold began, and she saw its hand pass through the rising heat, saw how the warmth caused it pain or something like pain, saw how it could not cross that boundary without surrendering something essential. It took what she'd offered, the steam from its proximity to heat, the named hungers, the acknowledged loneliness, and as it consumed these things it became thinner, more translucent, less substantial. When it finally withdrew from the porch, backing into the falling snow, it left no footprints, cast no shadow, made no sound except a whisper that might have been her name or might have been wind through frozen branches. Sarah closed the door carefully, as if sudden movement might summon it back, and threw both locks with fingers that had gone numb despite the cabin's restored warmth. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.